February 1943. Guadalcanal was finally silent. 6 months of hell had ended with American victory, and the newspapers back home celebrated the turning point in the Pacific War. But 200 miles northwest, Admiral William Halsey knew a darker truth. The hardest fighting was still ahead. Japanese engineers were already transforming jungle islands into fortresses. Munda, Vila, Bairoko, names that meant nothing to Americans in February would become synonyms for carnage by summer. New Georgia would swallow nearly 5,000 American casualties in 5 weeks of fighting for a single coral airstrip. Pillbox by pillbox, yard by yard, through mud and blood. And before that meat grinder even began, something else would happen. Something that would strip Japan of its greatest naval mind. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of Pearl Harbor, would board a bomber for a routine inspection tour on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers had already read his complete itinerary. 18 P-38 Lightnings were waiting 325 miles away. You've heard of Guadalcanal. You've heard of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But the Central Solomons campaign that came between them rarely makes the history books. Yet this is where Americans learned the brutal cost of island hopping, where every advance was measured in casualties, where the jungle killed as many men as Japanese bullets. This is what happened after the famous victory. April 13th, 1943. Deep in the basement of a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts stared at a decoded Japanese message that would change the course of the war. It wasn't a battle plan or troop movement. It was an itinerary. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, was planning a morale-boosting tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. And the Japanese had radioed every detail in a code the Americans had already broken. The message was breathtaking in its specificity. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 o'clock in the morning on April 18th. He would fly in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. A second Betty would carry Vice Admiral Ugaki Matomi and other staff officers. 6 Zero fighters would escort them. The flight would arrive at Balal Airfield at 8 o'clock sharp. Yamamoto was legendary for his punctuality. Even the inspection schedule was included. The decoded message landed on Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk within hours. Here was an opportunity that defied probability. The man who planned Pearl Harbor would be flying within range of American fighters based at Guadalcanal. One mission could eliminate Japan's greatest naval mind. But the decision wasn't simple. Shooting down Yamamoto would strongly suggest America was reading Japanese codes. Tokyo would likely tighten their encryption systems. Intelligence officers argued the long-term value of code breaking outweighed killing one man. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, disagreed. So did Admiral Nimitz. Yamamoto wasn't just any admiral. He had commanded at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the battles around Guadalcanal. He understood carrier warfare better than anyone in the Japanese military. No other officer could replace him. The Japanese might change their codes, but they couldn't produce another Yamamoto. On April 14th, Nimitz sent authorization to Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area. According to widely reported accounts, the message from Halsey's headquarters was enthusiastic. Something along the lines of, "Tally-ho, let's get the bastard." Halsey immediately contacted his air commanders. The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher called a secret meeting on April 16th. Only a handful of officers attended. The security was absolute. They studied the problem like a complex equation with only one possible solution. The P-38 Lightning was the only American fighter with enough range to fly from Guadalcanal to Bougainville and back. Even with external fuel tanks, the round trip would push the Lightnings to their absolute maximum range. There would be no margin for error. Major John Mitchell, a veteran P-38 pilot, was chosen to lead the strike group. Mitchell spent the next day planning a flight path that seemed impossible. The Lightnings would have to fly over 400 miles to reach the interception point south of Empress Augusta Bay, then over 400 miles back. Nearly 900 miles total. The flight path couldn't be direct. Japanese radar stations dotted the Solomons. If they detected the American fighters heading north, the mission would fail. Mitchell plotted a dogleg route, 5 separate legs taking the fighters far out to sea around Japanese observation posts. They would fly at wave-top level the entire way. The timing had to be perfect. Yamamoto's flight would arrive at Balale at 8 o'clock in the morning. The interception should happen around 9:35. Working backward, Mitchell calculated his strike group would need to depart Guadalcanal around 7 to 10 in the morning. 18 P-38s were assigned to the mission. 4 aircraft, the killer flight under Captain Thomas Lanphier, would attack the bombers. The remaining 14 would fly combat air patrol above. Even with perfect planning, the odds were astronomical. Mitchell later estimated the chances at about 1,000 to 1. But they would try. April 18th, 1943, dawned clear over Rabaul. Admiral Yamamoto rose early and dressed in his field uniform, olive green with white gloves and his ceremonial sword. Several staff officers had advised cancelling the tour. Yamamoto refused. He was a stickler for punctuality. The men at the forward bases expected him. The Americans wouldn't know he was coming. At 6 o'clock precisely, Yamamoto climbed aboard Betty Bomber 323. Admiral Ugaki and staff officers boarded the second Betty. 6 Zero fighters took position as escorts. Flying time, 2 hours. At Guadalcanal, Major Mitchell's strike group had departed at 7 to 10. Within minutes, 2 Lightnings developed mechanical problems. One blew a tire, another couldn't get its fuel tanks to feed. Both were from the killer flight. 2 alternates slid into position, but the mission was down to 16 aircraft. The remaining Lightnings dropped to 50 feet above the ocean. Radio silence was absolute. The cockpits were sweltering at sea level under the tropical sun. Detection meant failure. Mitchell navigated by compass, clock, and instinct through the carefully plotted legs. According to operational reconstructions, the route took them on precise headings, 265 degrees, then 290, then 305, then 20 degrees, then 90, threading between Japanese observation posts. At 9:34, Mitchell's formation crossed Empress Augusta Bay. They were 1 minute early. The navigation had been perfect. Then someone shouted over the radio, "Bogies! 11 o'clock high." There, at 4,000 feet, exactly where calculated, were 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zero fighters descending toward Balale. The Japanese were flying serenely, completely unaware. But complications emerged. 2 bombers meant uncertainty about which carried Yamamoto. and two of the killer flight's P-38s were having trouble releasing belly tanks. The killer flight was effectively down to 2 aircraft. Mitchell ordered Captain Lanphier to attack anyway. The Zeros finally spotted the Americans at 9:35. They immediately dove, but made a critical error, firing ahead of the P-38s to create a bullet curtain rather than firing directly at them. It didn't work. Aboard the bombers, the pilots reacted instantly. One Betty banked hard right, diving toward the jungle. The other banked left toward the coast. The distance between them opened rapidly. What happened next has been debated for 80 years. 2 American pilots would claim credit for shooting down Yamamoto. Captain Lanphier reported turning left to engage diving Zeros, shooting one down, then finding the lead Betty skimming the jungle. He fired across its flight path. The right engine caught fire, then the wing tore off and the bomber exploded in the jungle. Lieutenant Rex Barber tells a different story. He says he banked right and fell in behind one Betty at 1,000 feet. He fired at the right engine. The bomber shuddered, stopped in midair, then crashed into the jungle. He got no return fire. The controversy has never been fully resolved. The US Air Force ultimately split credit between both pilots, though many historians and later analyses favor Barber as the effective shooter. The debate continues. Meanwhile, Lieutenants Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine pursued the second Betty and opened fire. Barber followed and fired one burst. The bomber exploded. In the subsequent dogfight with remaining Zeros, Hine's P-38 was damaged. Smoke trailed from his right engine. He turned east, heading out to sea. He was last seen at 9:40, losing altitude. He never returned, the only American casualty of Operation Vengeance. Mitchell ordered the withdrawal before Japanese fighters could scramble from Kahili. All 15 surviving Lightnings made it home, operating at the absolute limit of their fuel range. At Bougainville, a Japanese rescue party was organized. On April 20th, searchers hacked through jungle to reach the wreckage. The bomber had crashed nose first and burned. 11 bodies scattered in the debris. No survivors. Admiral Yamamoto was still strapped in his seat. 2 bullets had struck him, one through his left shoulder, another through his lower jaw. He had been killed instantly. His white-gloved hand still gripped his sword. Off Moiler Point, Admiral Ugaki had miraculously survived the second Betty's crash into the water. He was thrown clear with 2 others. His injuries were severe, severed radial artery and compound fracture of the right arm, but he was alive. He wouldn't return to duty until 1944. Tokyo was paralyzed by the news. For 2 days, the High Command debated what to tell the public. On May 7th, the battleship Musashi set sail from Truk carrying Yamamoto's ashes. On May 21st, the Japanese people learned that Yamamoto was gone. The announcement stunned the nation. Radio broadcasts were interrupted. Newspapers published special editions with black borders. Yamamoto was posthumously awarded the Grand Order of the Chrysanthemum, First Class, and promoted to Fleet Admiral. His state funeral was scheduled for June 5th, the first anniversary of Midway. June 5th, 1943. 3 million Japanese lined the streets of Tokyo. The roads to the cemetery were packed with mourners who had travelled for days. The funeral procession moved through the city under overcast skies. The silence was absolute except for weeping. Admiral Koga Minachi, Yamamoto's successor as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, attended the funeral. Later, he would say what every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy already knew. There was only one Yamamoto, and no one is able to replace him. His loss is an unsupportable blow to us. Koga inherited an impossible task. Yamamoto had understood carrier warfare instinctively. He had strategic vision spanning the entire Pacific. No other Japanese admiral possessed that combination of tactical brilliance and strategic insight. The death of Yamamoto affected the war in ways that wouldn't be fully apparent for years. Japan did tighten some code and cipher practices after his death, though American signals intelligence continued to yield valuable information. Many historians argue that Japanese naval strategy became more defensive and less creative without Yamamoto's leadership, though attributing all strategic changes to his death alone oversimplifies a complex situation. What is clear? His successors were competent, but they weren't Yamamoto. Operation Vengeance had been worth the risk. The loss of Japan's greatest naval mind was a blow they struggled to overcome. And in the Central Solomons, the real meat grinder was about to begin. June 1943. With Yamamoto dead and Operation Igo concluded, Admiral Halsey could finally turn his full attention to the next phase of the Solomon Islands campaign. The objective was clear: New Georgia Island and its nearly completed airfield at Munda. From that coral strip, Japanese bombers could reach Guadalcanal and threaten all American positions in the southern Solomons. But Halsey faced a fundamental problem. The Pacific Military Conference back in March had imposed strict limitations on resources. He could have one division for the invasion. Just one. Major General Barney Vogel, who understood the Japanese strength on New Georgia, argued that 2 divisions were the minimum required. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who would command the amphibious landings, formally requested 2 more divisions plus additional Marine Raider and Defense battalions on June 12th. Halsey refused. He has been debated for this decision ever since. Halsey had 3 more divisions available in Major General Oscar Griswold's 14th Corps. He could have committed a larger force from the start. But in his defense, Halsey was already looking ahead to Bougainville, where a major battle was expected with few possibilities of receiving reinforcements. The competing priorities of Operation Cartwheel, the broader offensive against Rabaul, meant resources had to be carefully allocated. The division assigned to Operation Toenails was the 43rd Infantry Division, a National Guard unit brought up to strength with draftees. Their only real combat experience consisted of the unopposed landings in the Russell Islands back in February. They were green troops who had never faced determined resistance. They would learn fast, or they would die. Major General John Hester commanded the 43rd. Under him were 3 infantry regiments, the 103rd, 169th, and 172nd, plus supporting artillery, engineers, and headquarters units. Total strength on paper, about 14,000 men. Additional forces were attached for specific missions. The 1st Marine Raider Regiment, reorganized just 3 months earlier under Lieutenant Colonel Harry Liversedge, would conduct operations on the northern coast. The 9th Marine Defense Battalion brought 155mm guns and a platoon of M3 Stuart light tanks. Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees, would build airfields and bases once the fighting moved inland. and a New Zealand-trained unit of 130 South Pacific Islanders, known as the 1st Commando Fiji Guerrillas, would provide reconnaissance and jungle expertise. Admiral Turner's amphibious force was substantial despite the troop limitations. He had 4 attack transports, 2 attack cargo ships, numerous landing craft, and destroyer escorts. For air cover, Admiral Aubrey Fitch could call on a grand total of 1,182 aircraft of all types: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, and transports. Of these, 626 belonged to Admiral Mark Mitcher's Air Solomons Command. Halsey's plan called for 4 simultaneous landings. On June 30th, the eastern landings would secure lines of communication. One force would occupy Wickham Anchorage on the southeastern coast of New Georgia as a layover base for landing craft. Another would secure Segi Point for its airfield site. A third would take Viru Harbour as a small craft base. The main effort, the Western Landing Force under General Hester, would seize Rendover Island directly across Blanche Channel from Munda. From Rendover, American artillery could shell Munda while troops prepared for the main assault. Once Rendover was secure, the 172nd and 169th Regiments would cross to Zanana Beach on New Georgia itself, advance overland to the Baraiki River, and launch the final drive on Munda from there. Hester also planned a flanking maneuver, landing a battalion on Munda's west coast to execute a hook around the Japanese defences. It looked good on paper. On the ground, almost nothing would go according to plan. Facing them, Major General Minoru Sasaki commanded the Southeast Detachment, a mixed force of Imperial Japanese Army and Navy troops. Estimates of Japanese strength in the New Georgia sector vary by source and date, ranging from roughly 8,000 to over 10,000 men, depending on whether nearby garrisons and naval landing forces are included. Sasaki was a skilled defensive commander who understood terrain. He had spent months preparing New Georgia's defences. The Japanese defensive system was a masterpiece of camouflage and interlocking fire. Pillboxes built from logs and coral were invisible until you were on top of them. Each position supported 2 or 3 others. Machine guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Approach routes were pre-registered for mortar fire. Communications trenches connected strong points. The main defensive line ran east from the airfield at Munda, taking advantage of low ridges and dense jungle. Secondary positions protected Bairoko Harbour on the north coast, the supply base, where Japanese barges brought in reinforcements and ammunition every night. Strong points at Enagai Inlet and along the Dragon's Peninsula guarded the northern approaches. Sasaki had one critical weakness. Communications were poor. He had no maps. Company-sized units were scattered in exposed locations at Wickham Anchorage, Viru Harbour, and Rendover Harbour, places where they would be overrun in the initial American landings. Those troops could have been better used, strengthening the main defensive line. But overall, Sasaki had built a fortress that would extract a terrible price. By late June, all preparations were complete. D-Day was set for June 30th. To support the landings, Allied air and naval forces would strike Japanese bases the night before, softening defences and preventing quick reinforcements. General George Kenney's 5th Air Force would launch a heavy raid against Rabaul. Admiral Aaron Merrill's cruisers would take mine layers up to the Shortland Islands to mine the southern entrance to Buin and bombard Balali, Faizi, and the Poparang Islands. The night of June 29th was dark and stormy. Rain hammered down. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. the scheduled bomber missions had to be scrubbed. Merrill's vessels carried out their bombardment and mine-laying anyway, firing blind through driving rain at targets they could barely see. Despite the weather, Admirals Turner and Fort departed from their respective bases right on schedule. The invasion was on. June 30th, 1943. 02:25 hours. The first American troops hit the beaches at Honiavasa, Baraulu, and Sasaveli Islands, tiny specks of land in Blanche Channel between Rendover and New Georgia. These would serve as staging bases for the main assault. The landings went smoothly, except for one problem. The destroyer Zane ran hard aground in the darkness and poor visibility. She would be stuck there for hours. The Rendover Harbour Landing Group, tasked with going in ahead of the main force to secure the beachhead, missed the flashing light marking the narrow Renard entrance. In the darkness and rain, they landed in complete disorder alongside the 1st Battalion, 172nd Regiment. It didn't matter. There were only 140 Japanese defenders on Rendover, and they were taken completely by surprise. By 0600 hours, the main landing at Rendover began. Hurried, but effective. General Hester's 2nd Battalion, 172nd Regiment, came ashore under sporadic sniper fire from the scattered Japanese defenders. The beach was secured within the hour. The 2nd Battalion established a defensive perimeter while engineers struggled with the heavily waterlogged ground. Digging foxholes in that swampy terrain was nearly impossible. The Japanese defenders, outnumbered and cut off, scattered inland. Some tried to build makeshift rafts to escape to the New Georgia mainland. American patrols and patrol boats intercepted them. By the end of the day, most of the Rendover garrison had been killed or captured. The Japanese on Banga Island, just offshore from Rendover, tried to interfere with the unloading. They opened fire with 12-centimeter guns on the western destroyers. One shell hit the destroyer Gwyn, causing damage but no casualties. The destroyers Fahrenholt and Buchanan engaged the shore batteries, while the damaged Gwyn laid smoke to obscure the transports. The Japanese guns fell silent. With the beachhead secured, Hester began bringing the bulk of his forces ashore. Seabees started constructing a naval and artillery base. The unloading proceeded at a satisfactory pace despite the marshy terrain, which made moving supplies inland difficult. To the east, Admiral George Fort's forces were making their 3 separate landings. At Wickham Anchorage, on the southeastern coast of New Georgia, Fort planned to land 2 companies of the 4th Marine Raiders and Lieutenant Colonel Lester Brown's 2nd Battalion, 103rd Regiment, on a 500-yard beach at Olawana Bay. The 4th Raiders went in first aboard destroyer transports. But a series of mishaps due to bad weather scattered them across the area. 6 Higgins boats wrecked. Raiders were stranded on reefs. 1 platoon got separated entirely. Brown's LCIs, Landing Craft Infantry, had an easier time finding the well-marked beach, and his troops landed without incident. After reuniting with the scattered raiders, Brown learned the main Japanese base was at Kyoruku village, with a secondary camp at Vura. He sent Company E to deal with Vura, while the bulk of his forces set out inland for Kyoruku. The advance was slow. Driving rain turned trails into rivers. Streams swelled and became impassable. Meanwhile, General Sasaki had sent orders for the Wickham garrison to withdraw around the northern coast of New Georgia. But the Japanese were in no position to retreat. Their barges were scattered throughout Morovo Lagoon. they would have to fight. Shortly after midday, Brown's attack began. The Americans hit the Japanese from the north side of the Kairuku River. The defenders hadn't expected an approach from that direction. By nightfall, the Japanese had been pressed back to Seke Point, where their artillery was positioned. At Vura, Company E scattered the secondary position. The next day, under artillery fire, Brown called for air and naval support for a final assault. But he would have to wait until July 3rd, allowing most of the enemy forces to withdraw under cover of darkness. When the destroyers finally shelled Seke Point on July 3rd and 18, SBD dive bombers dropped their ordnance. Brown's troops went in to find 7 dazed Japanese killed and 1 captured. Raiders then searched Gatukai Island. The Japanese lookouts were gone. At Segi Point, the situation had developed differently. The preemptive landing of Colonel Michael Curran's 4th Raiders on June 20th had already secured that objective. On June 30th, the plan shifted to Viru Harbour. Curran had left Segi on June 27th with 2 companies, landing at a village west of Nono Lagoon the next morning. Setting out overland through mangrove swamp, his forces failed to reach their objective by June 30th. They were still advancing slowly from the Choi River, encountering Japanese patrols. Early on June 30th, Fort's destroyers entered Viru Harbour expecting to find Curran's raiders. Instead, they came under fire from a Japanese 3-inch field gun at Tetemara. The destroyers hastily withdrew and landed their company at Segi instead to join the raiders overland. During the morning, Curran split his forces. 2 platoons attacked Tombe, while the main body circled west of the harbour, crossed the Mango River, and approached Tetemara from the southwest. Marching through deep swamp, they had to advance during the night using tree light, chunks of decaying phosphorescent bark that gave off a luminous glow in the darkness. It was eerie and exhausting. By July 1st, as Curran prepared to attack, Sasaki ordered the Viru garrison to withdraw overland toward Munda. Around 0845, the outpost at Tombe was rapidly overwhelmed. At 0900, 17 SBD dive bombers dropped bombs on Tetemara, completely disrupting the Japanese artillery positions. An hour later, the Japanese opened fire on the raiders. Curran pushed forward. After 1100 hours, his forces encountered heavy machine gun fire on both flanks. Each machine gun position had to be destroyed individually. This is where the raiders suffered most of their casualties. At 1600 hours, Curran launched his final assault. 30 minutes later, Tetemara was occupied. But roughly 160 Japanese soldiers had escaped into the jungle, heading for Munda. Back at Rendova, at 1500 hours, just before Admiral Turner's transports were scheduled to withdraw, the situation changed dramatically. Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul had been shocked to learn at 0650 that Turner's destroyer screen was off Rendova. He immediately ordered airstrikes. At 1545, the first Japanese strike arrived. 26 G4M Betty bombers and 24 Zero fighters. After circling over the Roviana Islands, the formation dropped to attack the convoy from the port side. 16 Corsairs and 16 Wildcats intercepted them. The air battle rolled over Rendova Harbour. American fighters tore into the Japanese formation, but some bombers got through. A torpedo hit the transport Macaulay, Admiral Turner's flagship, detonating amidships with devastating effect. The ship was doomed. Turner transferred to a destroyer as Macaulay began listing heavily. She would sink during the night. For the Japanese, the cost was staggering. 10 Zeros and 19 Betty bombers were shot down. Over half the strike force destroyed. At 1720, a second Japanese strike appeared. 21 Zeros and 9 D-3 AVAL dive bombers. This attack was chaotic and poorly coordinated. American fighters intercepted them immediately. 7 Zeros and 1 VAL were destroyed. Not a single hit was scored on American shipping. By the end of June 30th, Air Solomons had destroyed 1/4 of Admiral Kusaka's air strength while losing only 17 fighters. The losses were so heavy that Kusaka would have to ask General Imamura to commit the 6th Air Division in future operations. But the landings were complete. Rendover, Wickham, Segi, and Viru Harbor were in American hands. The beachhead was secured. Now came the hard part. July 4th, 1943. While Americans back home celebrated Independence Day with parades and fireworks, a different kind of celebration was about to begin in Kula Gulf. Colonel Harry Liversedge's Northern Landing Group, 4,600 troops, was preparing to land at Rice Anchorage on the northern coast of New Georgia. The mission was to cut off Japanese supply lines. Bairoko Harbor on the northwest coast was the main barge base where Japanese reinforcements came in every night. If Liversedge could take Enogai Inlet and then Bairoko, Munda would be isolated. General Sasaki's troops wouldn't be able to receive supplies or evacuate wounded. Admiral Turner assigned 7 destroyer transports, 2 fast minesweepers, and 4 destroyers to carry Liversedge's forces into Kula Gulf. They would be covered by Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth's task group, 3 light cruisers and 10 destroyers. Ainsworth would also deliver a preliminary bombardment of Vila and Bairoko. On the night of July 4th, Ainsworth led the Northern Landing Group up the slot. At the same time, Rear Admiral Akiyama Teruo was heading south with his own force, 4 destroyers carrying 1,300 troops to Vila. The Japanese were using Vila as a staging point for moving reinforcements to Munda. Around midnight, Ainsworth entered Kula Gulf, carefully avoiding the minefield his own forces had laid back in May. He proceeded to shell Vila. But Ainsworth failed to detect the Japanese vessels heading south. The Japanese, however, detected the Americans. At 0015, the new radar on the destroyer Niyazuki picked up Ainsworth's force. Admiral Akiyama was greatly outnumbered, 4 destroyers against 13 American ships. He decided to abort the troop landing mission. But before withdrawing, Akiyama ordered his destroyers to fire torpedoes. At 003014, Type 93 long-lance torpedoes were launched at a range of 10 miles. It seemed impossible they could hit anything at that distance. The torpedoes raced through the dark water at 49 knots. Ainsworth had no idea they were coming. At 0043, one of those torpedoes struck the destroyer, strung almost exactly amidships. The explosion nearly cut the ship in 2. Strong went down in minutes. Ainsworth believed the torpedo had come from a submarine. He sent destroyers to hunt for it, while continuing his bombardment of Vila. Meanwhile, the Japanese were already headed back up the slot at high speed. With strong sinking, Liversedge's forces landed on the south side of the Pundakono River. The landing went smoothly despite rain, darkness, and intermittent shelling from Japanese guns at Enogai. But Turner had ordered the transport group to clear the Gulf by 0700 hours, before daylight brought Japanese air attacks. This meant the transports had to leave hurriedly, with a significant percentage of cargo still aboard, including important communications equipment. Additionally, about 300 men of the 148th Regiment had to be landed further north. They wouldn't catch up with the main body until July 7th. Strong had been sunk, but the Japanese had failed to land their reinforcements. Admiral Akiyama decided to try again the following night, this time with 10 destroyers carrying 2,600 troops. Admiral Halsey had advance notice of this second attempt. He ordered Ainsworth to return to Kula Gulf and await the Japanese. Ainsworth's force was reinforced with the destroyers Radford and Jenkins to replace Strong and the damaged Chevalier. Ainsworth's battle plan was simple but deeply flawed. Once radar detected the Japanese, his cruisers would smother them with 6-inch gunfire at the ideal range of 8,000 to 10,000 yards. He believed this was beyond the range of Japanese torpedoes. He was wrong. His destroyers would only use their torpedoes to finish off crippled enemy ships. This was backwards. American torpedoes, the Mark 15, had a maximum range of 6,000 yards. Japanese type 93 torpedoes could reach over 20,000 yards and were far more reliable. But Ainsworth didn't know this, or didn't believe it. Departing Buin after sundown on July 5th, Akiyama's forces were divided into one covering force of 3 destroyers and 2 transport units of 3 and 4 destroyers each. Shortly after midnight on July 6th, Ainsworth's force arrived off the northwest point of New Georgia and continued forward into Kula Gulf. At the same time, Akiyama was entering from the north. He immediately detached his first transport unit to land its 1,600 troops. At 0106, Niizuki's radar detected the Americans. Akiyama prepared for battle. But when no confrontation erupted immediately, Akiyama began detaching his second transport unit at 0143. He thought he might slip past the Americans undetected. At 0140, American radar picked up the Japanese. Ainsworth began closing the range. At 0156, at a range of 6,800 yards from Niizuki, Ainsworth's cruisers opened fire. The Americans concentrated their salvos on Niizuki. She was promptly hit by several shells and set ablaze. Admiral Akiyama was on the bridge. He went down with his ship. But the Japanese torpedo crews had been well drilled. As soon as the American guns flashed, they fired a full salvo of 16 torpedoes in that direction. Ainsworth had no idea what was coming. At 0203, 3 torpedoes struck the cruiser Helena. The ship broke in 2. The aft section sank immediately. The forward section stayed afloat long enough for some of the crew to abandon ship, but 168 men died. 1 torpedo hit the cruiser Street Lewis, but failed to detonate. Another just missed Honolulu. If those had exploded, the battle would have been far worse for the Americans. As the Japanese began retreating toward Buin, Ainsworth directed his 2 remaining cruisers to shell the second transport unit at 0218. They caused minor damage to 3 destroyers. The destroyer Nagatsuki ran aground near Bambari Harbor and would be destroyed by American aircraft the next day. At 0330, Ainsworth decided to retire back to Tulagi. Meanwhile, the first transport unit had completed unloading its 1,600 troops and was withdrawing successfully. The Battle of Kula Gulf was a tactical victory for Japan. They lost 2 destroyers and Admiral Akiyama. but they sank Strong and Helena and successfully landed reinforcements. American commanders were beginning to understand a painful truth. Japanese destroyers, armed with the Long Lance torpedo and crewed by expert night fighters, ruled these waters after dark. More Japanese reinforcements were on the way, and at Munda, the real killing was about to begin. July 9th, 1943. After 9 days of delay and confusion, Brigadier General Leonard Wing was finally ready to launch the main assault on Munda. His forces had assembled at Zanana Beach and advanced to the Barike River, the jumping-off line for the attack. The delays had cost the Americans dearly. General Sasaki had used every hour to reinforce his eastern defensive line running north from Ilangana Point. By July 6th, he had 2 full battalions manning that line, with a company establishing a roadblock position in front of the barrage. Felled trees, barbed wire, and camouflaged pillboxes blocked the approach. On July 7th, the 3rd Battalion, 169th Regiment attacked the roadblock. These were Green troops, National Guardsmen, who had never been in combat. They were repulsed almost immediately. Shaken and disorganized, they dug in for the night. The attack on the roadblock continued on July 8th. This time, it succeeded. But the delays forced General Hester to cancel the planned hook around Munda's west coast and to postpone the main offensive until July 9th. The plan for July 9th called for a massive preliminary bombardment. At dawn, Commander Ali Burke's 7 destroyers moved into Blanche Channel to pound Lambetti Plantation with 4,000 rounds of 5-inch shells. Simultaneously, Brigadier General Nathan Twining, the new commander of Air Solomons, sent approximately 171 bombers, covered by over 100 fighters. It was the largest air attack mounted by Air Solomons so far in the campaign. Great clouds of smoke and dust hung over Munda. It looked devastating. But for all the ordnance dropped, Japanese losses were comparatively light. The defenders were deep in their log and coral bunkers, and most of those couldn't be seen from the air anyway. As the bombardment finished, General Wing's ground assault began under clear skies. The 172nd Regiment forded the chest-high Barike River and advanced slowly westward. They managed to gain 1,100 yards before digging in for the night. But the 169th Regiment did not move. The 3rd Battalion, badly shaken by the roadblock fight, was relieved by the 1st Battalion. Even then, the regiment stayed in place. This was the reality of Green troops meeting battle-hardened defenders. The men of the 43rd Division had never experienced combat like this. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see 10 yards away. Every tree, every bush, every depression in the ground might hide a pillbox. Machine guns opened fire from positions that were invisible until the muzzle flash gave them away. And even when you spotted a position, it was almost impossible to destroy. Sasaki's defensive system was a masterpiece. Each pillbox was built from logs or coral blocks, covered with earth and vegetation. They blended perfectly into the jungle. Firing slits were narrow, just wide enough for a machine gun barrel. The positions were mutually supporting. If you tried to flank one pillbox, you came under fire from 2 others. Communication trenches connected strong points, so defenders could shift position without being seen. American casualties mounted rapidly. By July 10th, minimal gains had been made. The 172nd Regiment, now far ahead of the rest of the division, managed to advance a few hundred yards. The 169th Regiment, with its 1st Battalion leading, ran into a Japanese blocking position after advancing 1,500 yards. Despite artillery support from Brigadier General Harold Barker's guns on Rendova, the Americans could not clear the roadblock. During the night, the Japanese reinforced it further. The 43rd Division was being bled slowly. New problems emerged. The American forces had outdistanced their supply lines by July 10th. Supplies had to be carried forward over a trail that was knee-deep in mud. Wounded had to be carried out the same way. The physical exhaustion alone was breaking men down. General Hester decided to solve the supply problem by swinging the 172nd Regiment southwest to occupy Liana Beach. This was about 500 yards east of the main Japanese line at Ilangana. From Liana, supplies could come in by landing craft. The 172nd was to be supported by the 3rd Battalion, 103rd Regiment, and by the 9th Defence Battalion's 8 M3 Stuart tanks. The tanks would land at Liana on July 13th. On the morning of July 11th, the 172nd turned south and started moving toward the shore. They advanced through knee-deep mud while harassed by Japanese mortars. By midday, the regiment had moved 450 yards when Japanese pillboxes forced them to halt. The next day, the 172nd resumed its advance toward the beach, while the 169th attempted to envelop the Japanese left flank. Admiral Merrill provided a heavy naval bombardment in coordination with Rendova artillery and Air Solomon's planes. Merrill took his 4 light cruisers into the narrow confines of Blanche Channel, while 2 destroyers went ahead to fire on the Kokengolo Hill area. The mission was flawlessly executed, causing significant damage to the Munda base. But on the ground, the attack bogged down from the start. The 2 regiments became entangled as they tried to reach their positions. The 1st Battalion, 169th Regiment, managed to gain 300 yards in a direct assault on Japanese positions. But the 2nd Battalion received enfilading fire from the northernmost ridge and could not advance. To the south, the 172nd got within 500 yards of Liana, but was stopped by machine gun fire from a series of pillboxes connected by trenches extending northwest from Ilangana. To the north, a completely unexpected success was about to unfold. While the 172nd and 169th struggled, Colonel Harry Liversedge's forces were achieving their first objective. Liversedge had planned for Colonel Samuel Griffith's 1st Marine Raiders, reinforced with 2 companies from the 145th Regiment, to swing right and take the west shore of Enagai Inlet. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion, 148th Regiment, would advance southwest to block the Munda-Bairoko Trail. The goal was to cut off Munda from reinforcements coming down from Bairoko. On July 7th, the 148th troops reached the trail and completed a camouflaged roadblock the following day. Griffith's raiders secured the villages of Maranusa and Triri, then engaged Japanese patrols ahead. Though their presence was discovered, the Americans captured a Japanese defense plan showing the exact location of heavy guns at Inogai. On July 8th, after an inconclusive firefight, the raiders moved out toward Inogai, but found an impassable mangrove swamp. Major Hideo Obashi launched a strong counterattack against Triri, but the 145th Companies repelled it. The next day, Griffith resumed his advance, using a good trail, apparently unknown to the Japanese, that led over high ground west of the swamp. Meeting no opposition, the raiders were in sight of Leland Lagoon by noon. Then they swung slightly right and were immediately stopped by 2 Japanese machine guns. In the early hours of July 10th, Griffith sent forward a strong patrol. The patrol reached Enogai Inlet without opposition and reported discovering a fairly good route to the point. At 0700, Griffith ordered B Company to assault while his other forces contained the main Japanese positions. Supported by mortar fire, B Company drove forward rapidly. They cleared the village of Baconaru and captured 2 machine guns. Shortly after midday, the Japanese began evacuating Enogai, leaving only small pockets of resistance but suffering heavy losses to American machine guns. The raiders pushed over Enogai Point to the sea, established beach defenses, and cleared the area by July 11th. They had taken Enogai just in time. They had run out of food and water. The raiders suffered 131 casualties. The Japanese Kure 6th Special Naval Landing Force reported 81 killed and 1 army platoon was lost. These losses forced Liversedge to request the 4th Raiders be landed as reinforcements for the final attack on Bairoko. The reinforcements wouldn't arrive until July 18th. Back at the main front, the situation was deteriorating. By mid-July, casualties in the 43rd Division were mounting at an alarming rate. Post-action reports and divisional records document extraordinarily high numbers of both combat casualties and neuropsychiatric cases, the latter including approximately 1,950 evacuations for what was then called war neurosis or combat fatigue. The exact casualty breakdown varies by source and reporting period, but the scale was unprecedented for this division. General Hester recognized he needed reinforcements. He could not launch a coordinated offensive against Munda without fresh troops. Fortunately, elements of the 37th Division were arriving, but time was needed to prepare them for action. For now, all Hester could do was maintain pressure with harassing fire from artillery and airstrikes, and wait for help. The meat grinder had begun, and it would only get worse. July 12, 1943. Admiral Kusaka had decided to reinforce Kolombangara with another 1,200 troops from the 45th Regiment. This time, Rear Admiral Shunji Isaki would command the operation, leading a force of 5 destroyers from Rabaul in a covering role, while 4 destroyers carried the reinforcements. As the convoy made its run down the slot during the morning, Allied coast watchers spotted them. Admiral Halsey immediately ordered Rear Admiral Ainsworth to head north to prevent the landings. Ainsworth's force was reinforced to 3 light cruisers and 10 destroyers, though half of them were inexperienced and had to be hurriedly taught the battle plans and operating procedures. Ainsworth set sail during the afternoon. By nightfall, both forces were approaching Kolombangara. At 0035 on July 13th, a PBY managed to report the course and composition of Isaki's force. Ainsworth prepared to intercept. As the 2 forces converged, Admiral Isaki sent his destroyer transports through Vela Gulf to land their troops. By 0100 hours, he had been alerted to the approaching enemy. Despite being detected first, the Japanese gained visual contact at 0108. They would be the first to attack. By 0114, Isaki's destroyers had launched a large salvo of torpedoes. At roughly the same time, the American destroyers launched their own torpedo attack. But this attack would fail because of the shorter range of the Mark 15 torpedo. When the Japanese column closed to 10,000 yards at 0112, Ainsworth ordered his cruisers to open fire. They concentrated on the Jintsu, which was leading the formation. Immediately, the cruiser was set ablaze. Admiral Isaki was killed, the second admiral to die in these waters in just 1 week. The Americans launched another unsuccessful torpedo attack at 0114, but at the same time, the Japanese torpedoes were arriving. Although the Allied ships began evasive action, the New Zealand cruiser Leander was struck at 0122. Ainsworth detached 2 destroyers to escort the crippled cruiser back to base. At this point, the 1,200 Japanese reinforcements had been successfully unloaded. The destroyer transports were moving north to withdraw. The remaining destroyers of Isaki's covering group were heading southeast to re-engage after reloading their torpedoes. In just 18 minutes, the Americans sank Jintsu with a torpedo at 0145 and then headed northwest to pursue the enemy. Though the Japanese destroyers were detected by Honolulu's radar at 0156, Ainsworth doubted whether these were his own destroyers. This hesitation allowed the enemy to fire another massive torpedo barrage. The results were devastating. Both Street Louis and Honolulu were hit and suffered heavy damage. The destroyer Gwyn was struck amidships and would have to be scuttled. In total, the Battle of Kolombangara cost approximately 89 Allied sailors killed, with USS Gwyn accounting for 61 of those losses. The Japanese cruiser Jintsu went down with roughly 482 men. This essentially ended the Battle of Kolombangara. Ainsworth desperately retreated to Tulagi with his remaining ships. Despite the loss of Jintsu, the undamaged Japanese vessels had landed their reinforcements and inflicted heavy damage on Ainsworth's force. The pattern was becoming clear. American cruisers engaging Japanese destroyers in the restricted waters of the Solomons was not working. This battle, along with previous engagements, helped convince American naval leadership to change night fighting tactics. Future operations would rely more on destroyer formations in night torpedo actions until cruiser doctrine and radar employment could be improved. The Long Lance torpedo had proven itself again. With a range exceeding 20,000 yards and devastating explosive power, it outclassed anything in the American arsenal. Japanese destroyer crews were expert night fighters who could reload and fire again in less than 20 minutes. Until American commanders adapted their tactics, the night belonged to Japan. But on land, the meat grinder continued. July 10th through 17th. 7 days of hell. The 43rd Division ground forward yard by Bloody Yard through the jungle approaches to Munda. General Wing's 2 infantry regiments were now stretched across a front that extended from the coast inland toward the high ground north of the airfield. The 172nd Regiment, far ahead of the rest of the division, continued pushing southwest toward Liana Beach. The 169th Regiment faced the main Japanese blocking position east of Ilangana. The roadblock couldn't be cleared. Every attack was repulsed. Japanese defenders were dug into positions that were invisible until American troops were within grenade-throwing distance. Machine guns swept every approach. Mortars dropped shells with uncanny accuracy. The terrain itself was an enemy. Knee-deep mud sucked at boots with every step. Roots and vines tangled equipment. The jungle canopy blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight. Heat and humidity were suffocating. Men soaked through their uniforms in minutes. Supply lines stretched to breaking. By July 10th, the forward units had outdistanced the supply dumps at Zanana Beach. Everything had to be carried forward by hand. Ammunition, water, rations, medical supplies. Teams of men hauled supplies up the trail through mud that came up to their knees, sometimes their waists. Casualties had to be carried out the same way. Stretcher bearers struggled through the mud with wounded men. The journey from the front line to the aid station could take hours. Men died on stretchers before they reached medical help. The physical exhaustion alone was breaking soldiers down. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Malaria was rampant. Dysentery turned the jungle into a cesspool. And always the combat stress. The constant fear. The invisible enemy. The sudden death that could come from any direction. On July 13th, something finally broke through. The 3rd Battalion, 169th Regiment, the same unit that had been shaken and repulsed at the roadblock days earlier, launched an unexpected attack. Now, under the command of Colonel Frederick Rienke, the battalion fought its way forward pillbox by pillbox for 4 hours. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting. Grenades thrown into firing slits. Flamethrowers spraying liquid fire over log bunkers. Rifle fire at point-blank range. By late afternoon, the battalion had secured a south ridge overlooking the Japanese positions. Colonel Rienke decided to hold his position. That night, the Japanese counterattacked. Wave after wave of screaming soldiers charged up the ridge. The Americans threw them back. All night the fighting continued. By dawn on July 14th, the ridge was still in American hands. The troops named it Rienke Ridge. The cost had been heavy, 101 casualties. But the ridge held, and its capture forced the Japanese to evacuate the North Spur, which was then occupied by the 2nd Battalion. Meanwhile, the 172nd Regiment continued its desperate push toward Liana Beach. Japanese patrols had cut the regiment's line of communication back to Zanana. The troops were hungry, low on ammunition, and increasingly isolated. On July 13th, the regiment finally reached Liana by late afternoon. They secured the beach and organized defensive positions. The following morning, General Hester landed the 3rd Battalion, 103rd Regiment, and the Marine tanks at Liana. More importantly, supplies could now come in by landing craft instead of being carried through the jungle. The Marine tanks, 8 M3 Stuarts from the 9th Defence Battalion, were supposed to be the breakthrough weapon. Light, mobile, and armed with 37mm guns, they should have been able to reduce Japanese pillboxes that infantry couldn't touch. But tank infantry coordination was non-existent. On July 16th and 17th, small attacks were launched with tank support. The tanks advanced. The infantry didn't keep up. The tanks rolled forward alone into Japanese kill zones. The Japanese had learned. After staff officers from Rabaul arrived to instruct the defenders in anti-tank tactics, Sasaki's troops were ready. They used mines, flamethrowers, and Molotov cocktails. By July 18th, multiple tanks had been disabled or knocked out. General Griswold, who had arrived on July 14th to assume overall command of the occupation force, made the decision to withdraw the remaining operational tanks. He also requested the 10th Defence Battalion's tanks be sent as replacements. But the lesson was clear: tanks without proper infantry support were vulnerable and ineffective. By mid-July, the situation had become critical. Casualties in the 43rd Division had reached alarming levels. Post-action reports and divisional records document the scale of losses, large numbers of combat casualties, combined with an unprecedented number of neuropsychiatric evacuations. Approximately 1,950 men were evacuated for what was then called war neurosis, combat fatigue, shell shock, psychological breakdown. The total casualty figures vary by source and reporting period, but the impact on the division's combat effectiveness was devastating. General Hester knew he couldn't continue the offensive without reinforcements. The 43rd Division was spent. Fortunately, help was on the way. General Griswold immediately directed Major General Robert Beitler to bring the remainder of his 37th Division to New Georgia. He also ordered Major General J. Lawton Collins to prepare his 161st Regiment to move to the island. Additionally, Admiral Turner was relieved as commander of the South Pacific Amphibious Force. He was ordered to take command of the Central Pacific offensives. Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson would replace him. For now, all anyone could do was wait. Wait for reinforcements. Wait for the 37th Division to arrive. And maintain pressure on the Japanese with artillery and airstrikes. The offensive had stalled, but the dying hadn't stopped. While the 43rd Division bled itself against the Ilangana line, General Sasaki was preparing a counter-offensive. He had one advantage the Americans didn't fully appreciate: the elite 13th Regiment. Colonel Tomonari Satoshi's 13th Regiment had a reputation. They were considered among the best infantry in the Imperial Japanese Army. Battle-hardened, disciplined, fanatically determined. 2 battalions of the 13th had already made it to New Georgia via Vila. Now Sasaki intended to use them. His plan was audacious. The 13th Regiment would bypass the American roadblock on the 148th Regiment's position. They would take their forces around the American right flank, march overland to the East Bridge at the headwaters of the Baraik River, and then drive through to Zanana Beach. If successful, they would destroy the American rear installations, cut the line of communications, and surround the American regiments on the front lines. On July 14th, Colonel Tomonari began his march. The Japanese had no maps. They were forced to hack a trail through virgin jungle, and they were hit repeatedly by American airstrikes and artillery bombardments. The pressure to live up to the 13th Regiment's reputation drove the men forward. But the cost was terrible. The 3-day march became a death march. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Heat stroke claimed dozens. Artillery shells burst in the tree canopy, sending shrapnel and wooden splinters slicing down. The regiment suffered enormous losses before the assault even began. But on the night of July 17th, Tomonari was finally in position. His troops moved down the jeep road towards Zanana Beach. Their target, General Hester's headquarters. The headquarters was defended by a platoon of the 43rd Reconnaissance Troop. 70 Fijian commandos provided additional security. Against them, Tomonari could throw 2 depleted battalions, maybe 800 men total, exhausted and disorganized from the march. At the same time, the 229th Regiment launched its own limited offensive, aimed at preventing the troops at the front from coming to aid the Zanana defenders. If executed properly, Sasaki's plan could destroy the 43rd Division's rear installations, cut supply lines, and surround the American regiments. Tomonari's attack began shortly after midnight, but it was disorganized and chaotic from the start. It looked more like a series of raids than an organized assault. The reconnaissance troops easily repelled the Japanese at the engineer and medical bivouacs. The Fijians at the command post mowed down screaming Japanese who rushed from the jungle in all directions. The close-in fighting was fierce and confused. Japanese soldiers briefly penetrated the perimeter and destroyed valuable communications equipment. But they couldn't prevent General Barker's artillery from laying a tight box barrage around the command post. The artillery fire was devastating. Shells crashed down in a perfect rectangle around the headquarters. Any Japanese soldier caught in that box was torn apart. The ground shook continuously. Trees splintered. Earth erupted in fountains. The noise was deafening. The surviving Japanese had no choice but to retreat back up the jeep road. Tomonari's troops kept the road blocked for the next 3 days. But Sasaki's counteroffensive had failed. In response to the new threat, the 148th Regiment was landed at Zanana on July 18th. They were sent to Riinki Ridge to relieve the spent 169th. With the 13th Regiment blocking the jeep road, the two forces skirmished over the next few days. On July 21st, Colonel Tomonari was sitting on a log listening to a company commander report. A mortar shell landed at his feet. He was killed instantly. The elite 13th Regiment had lost its commander. The counter-offensive was over. By July 22nd, the regiment finally withdrew to the Yahata Highlands. On the same day, the 169th Regiment was finally relieved. General Beitler assumed direct command of all 37th Division units in New Georgia. Sasaki's gamble had failed. The 13th Regiment had suffered heavy casualties, including many officers, for no gain. But they had bought time. Time for Sasaki to reinforce his defences. Time to prepare for the inevitable American offensive. And that offensive was coming. July 20th, 1943. While the 13th Regiment was launching its doomed counterattack on Zanana Beach, Colonel Harry Liversedge was preparing to attack Bairoko Harbour. Bairoko was critical to the Japanese defence of New Georgia. It was the main barge base on the northwest coast. Every night, barges from Vila brought reinforcements, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They evacuated wounded. They transported troops between positions. If Bairoko fell, Munda would be isolated. Liversedge had already secured Inogai Inlet on July 10th and 11th. Now he was ready for the main assault. His plan called for the 1st and 4th Marine Raiders to advance down the Inogai-Bairoko Trail and attack frontally. The 3rd Battalion, 148th Regiment, would move along the Triri-Bairoko Trail to hit the Japanese southern flank. On paper, it looked feasible. In reality, Liversedge was about to learn the same lesson the 43rd Division had learned at Munda. Japanese defensive positions in the jungle were nearly impossible to crack without overwhelming firepower. Strangely, Liversedge expected air support for the operation, but he appears to have requested it too late for missions to be scheduled. The raiders would go in without air cover. On the morning of July 20th, Liversedge cleared Inogai and began his march along the Bairoko-Inogai Trail. His forces moved in column. A platoon also moved down the Leland Lagoon sandspit to cover the extreme right flank. At the same time, the 148th soldiers departed Triri on an arduous march inland. Shortly after 1000 hours, Colonel Samuel Griffith's raiders stumbled upon Japanese outposts forward of the main defensive line. These were quickly reduced. The advance continued, but resistance increased with every step. Around noon, machine gun fire stopped the advance. Liversedge committed the 4th Raiders on Griffith's left. Progress remained slow. Casualties were mounting. Against them, Commander Okamura Saburo had established a defensive masterpiece. 4 successive lines of mutually supporting pillboxes stood on low, parallel ridges running north to south. Each line supported the others. The positions were built from logs and coral blocks. They were invisible until you were on top of them. By 1430, one of Griffith's companies finally broke into the first defence line. For a moment, it seemed the attack might succeed. Then, at 1500 hours, Commander Okumura began laying down heavy and accurate mortar fire. The mortars were positioned on the ridges behind the first line. They had perfect observation of the killing zone. Shells dropped with uncanny precision. The area from Liversedge's headquarters all the way to the first defence line became a slaughterhouse. Men were torn apart by shrapnel. The wounded screamed. Corpsmen trying to reach them were cut down. The company that had broken into the first line was pushed back. The Marines were pinned. They couldn't move forward. They couldn't retreat. Additionally, the platoon on the sand spit was held up by Japanese machine guns and couldn't reach the mainland to make contact with Liversedge's main body. They were isolated and under fire. Liversedge's only hope was for the 3rd Battalion, 148th Regiment, to break through from the south. After marching 3,500 yards, the battalion had swung north toward Bairoko. But they were stopped by a Japanese blocking position on high ground. By 1600 hours, Liversedge learned the 148th was stopped. He made the only decision he could. Withdraw. Starting from the left of the line, the raiders pulled back, company by company. Machine gun and mortar fire still hit them. But the withdrawal was made in good order. By nightfall, Liversedge's forces had established defensive positions near the south shore of Leland Lagoon. The casualties were devastating. Roughly 200 men killed or wounded. For zero gain. The following morning, the withdrawal to Inogai began. A strong airstrike was launched against Bairoko to cover the retreat. Exhausted and depleted, Liversedge's forces were ordered to sit tight and hold their positions at Enogai, Triri, and Rice Anchorage. The northern pincer had failed. Bairoko remained in Japanese hands. General Sasaki kept the 2nd Battalion, 45th Regiment at Bairoko for the duration of the fighting on New Georgia. It was an important storage area with tons of supplies that had been brought in by barges. The barge traffic would continue every night, keeping Munda reinforced and supplied. The lesson was brutal but clear. Japanese defensive positions built by experienced troops in jungle terrain could not be taken by frontal assault. Not without overwhelming artillery support. Not without airstrikes. Not without tanks and flamethrowers and massive firepower. The raiders had been sent in with rifles, grenades, and courage. It wasn't enough. By mid-July, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The 43rd Division was finished as an effective fighting force. Post-action reports paint a grim picture. Combat casualties had been heavy from the start. But what broke the division wasn't just the killed and wounded. It was the psychological casualties. Approximately 1,950 men were evacuated for neuropsychiatric reasons. War neurosis, combat fatigue, shell shock. Men who simply couldn't function anymore, who shook uncontrollably, who couldn't sleep, who saw Japanese soldiers in every shadow, who froze under fire, who broke down crying. This was unprecedented for an American division. The scale of psychological casualties was shocking to commanders who had never seen anything like it. But the 43rd Division had been thrown into a meat grinder. Green troops with minimal training, fighting an invisible enemy in nightmarish terrain. No clear front line, no safe rear area, just endless jungle, endless mud, and sudden death from any direction. General Hester requested reinforcements. He couldn't launch a coordinated offensive without fresh troops. The regiments on the line were spent. General Griswold, who had arrived to take overall command on July 14th, immediately began reorganizing. He directed Major General Robert Beitler to bring the remainder of his 37th Division to New Georgia. Major General J. Lawton Collins was ordered to prepare his 161st Regiment to move to the island as well. But these movements would take time. The 37th Division had to be transported from rear areas. Units had to be assembled, briefed, loaded onto ships, and moved forward. It would be at least a week before they were ready. In the meantime, small attacks continued with tank support. July 16th and 17th saw limited operations against the Ilangana line. But the lack of tank infantry coordination doomed these efforts. The tanks would advance. The infantry would hang back. The tanks rolled forward alone into prepared kill zones. Japanese anti-tank teams were waiting. Mines disabled tracks. Flamethrowers sprayed burning fuel through vision slits. Molotov cocktails exploded on engine compartments. By July 18th, several tanks had been knocked out or disabled. General Griswold made the decision to withdraw the remaining operational tanks. The early commitment of Marine Stewards had demonstrated that tanks without infantry support were extremely vulnerable. He requested the 10th Defence Battalion's tanks as replacements, but he also knew the next offensive would require better coordination, better training, better tactics. Between July 18th and 24th, Griswold reorganised his exhausted forces. The 169th Regiment was finally relieved after 2 weeks of continuous combat. The troops were hollow-eyed, gaunt, many showing signs of malaria and dysentery. They had done their job. Now they needed rest. General Beitler's 37th Division began taking over the northern sector. A new boundary was set 1,300 yards north of Ilangana. The 43rd Division would hold the southern portion. The 37th would push from the north. Griswold was reshuffling units for a coordinated offensive. This time, it would be done right. Artillery would soften targets. Airstrikes would hit Japanese positions. Tanks would advance with infantry. Flamethrowers would burn out pillboxes. And most importantly, fresh troops would lead the attack. But all of this would take time to prepare. Time for the 37th Division to get into position. Time for the 161st Regiment to arrive. Time to stockpile ammunition and supplies. time to coordinate with artillery and air support. The offensive had stalled. For now, all Griswold could do was maintain pressure with harassing fire. Artillery batteries on Rendover shelled Munda day and night. Air strikes continued whenever weather permitted. Patrols probed Japanese positions. But no major attacks were launched. By July 24th, all units had moved into position. Griswold scheduled the offensive to start July 25th. His plan was straightforward. Following a naval bombardment and heavy bombing, the American infantry, supported by Marine tanks and Barker's artillery, would make a frontal attack on the Japanese line. The 43rd Division on the left would take Lamberté Plantation and the airfield. The 37th Division on the right would take Bibelow Hill and envelop the Japanese north of the airfield. This time, with fresh troops, better coordination, and overwhelming firepower, the Americans would break through. Or so they hoped, because the Japanese were still there. Still dug in, still waiting, and they had no intention of giving up Munda without extracting every possible ounce of blood. The meat grinder was about to enter its final, bloodiest phase. July 25th, 1943. Dawn broke clear over New Georgia. After weeks of grinding stalemate, General Griswold was finally ready to launch a coordinated offensive with fresh troops, overwhelming firepower, and proper coordination. At first light, Commander Arleigh Burke's 7 destroyers moved into Blanche Channel. They took position off Lamberté Plantation and began a methodical bombardment. For over an hour, the destroyers pounded Japanese positions with 5-inch shells. The naval gunfire was heavy and sustained, systematically working over the target area. Almost simultaneously, Brigadier General Nathan Twining sent the largest airstrike of the campaign. 171 bombers, covered by over 100 fighters. Wave after wave of aircraft passed over Munda. Bombs tumbled from their racks. Explosions rippled across Lamberté Plantation. Great clouds of smoke and dust rose thousands of feet into the air, hanging over the battlefield like a funeral shroud. It looked devastating. It looked like nothing could survive that kind of bombardment. But the Japanese were deep in their bunkers, and most of those bunkers couldn't be seen from the air. The defenders huddled in log and coral shelters as the earth shook above them. Casualties were lighter than the Americans hoped. As the smoke cleared, the ground assault began under clear skies. This time, everything would be different. This time, the Americans had learned from 3 weeks of bloody failure. Flamethrowers proved decisive. Engineers moved forward with the infantry, carrying their bulky flame units. These weapons weighed over 70 pounds when fully loaded. The operator carried the fuel tanks on his back, while a second man helped feed the hose. When a pillbox was located, they would approach as close as they dared and spray liquid fire over the position. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The vegetation covering the position would burst into flame. The camouflage was stripped away in seconds. Logs smouldered and cracked. Smoke poured from firing slits. Anyone inside who didn't evacuate immediately died from heat and smoke inhalation. Those who tried to escape were cut down by rifle fire. Colonel Lester Brown's 103rd Regiment led the attack in the southern sector. Supported by artillery and flamethrowers, they moved forward methodically. No more wild rushes. No more unsupported attacks. Pillbox by pillbox, position by position, they advanced. By mid-afternoon, Brown's forces had reduced 74 pillboxes on a 600-yard front. It was brutal, exhausting work. But it was working. They advanced from Ilangana Point to Terrer. Then, from Terrer to Kia. By nightfall, the regiment had made more progress in one day than the division had made in the previous 2 weeks. But General Griswold was still dissatisfied. He blamed General Hester for the slow progress of the previous weeks. The 43rd Division had taken too long, suffered too many casualties, and failed to achieve its objectives on schedule. Fair or not, Hester would pay the price for the meat grinder. In the northern sector, General Beitler's 37th Division faced different challenges. Colonel James Dalton ordered another assault on Bartley Ridge. This time, supported by 6 tanks and 2 flamethrowers, the Americans finally overran a dozen pillbox positions. But the tangled terrain made tank operations nearly impossible. Roots and fallen logs blocked the way. Steep slopes threatened to overturn the vehicles. After 3 tanks were disabled, Dalton was forced to extricate the remaining armour. After 5 hours of fighting and an advance of 200 yards, the 3rd Battalion had suffered heavy casualties and had to withdraw once again. Colonel Thomas Holland also launched another assault on Horseshoe Hill with artillery support. The 1st Battalion managed to reoccupy Wing Hill and advance pillbox by pillbox toward the crest of Horseshoe. They got within 15 yards of the top, 15 yards from victory. Then, heavy machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions. Men fell. The advance stalled. The battalion was forced to withdraw and dig in just short of the crest, so close they could hear the Japanese defenders talking, but not close enough to take the hill. July 26th through 31st. 6 more days of grinding advance. 6 more days of heat, mud, and death. General Hodge had taken over tactical command of the 43rd Division from the exhausted Hester, though the official relief of command would come on July 29th. The offensive continued with a process of aggressive action and small unit manoeuvre, combined with constant artillery and mortar fire. The technique was simple but effective. Artillery would pound suspected Japanese positions. Infantry would advance until they met resistance. Mortars would pin down the defenders. Flamethrowers would burn them out. Then the infantry would advance again. The Japanese were gradually forced back from their high ground defences, but they made the Americans pay for every yard. The 43rd Division inched slowly forward, a few yards per day on the right flank, about 500 yards total along the coast. The cost in armour was severe. The Marine Stewarts from the 9th Defence Battalion had been committed piecemeal without proper infantry coordination. The results were predictable and disastrous. Japanese anti-tank teams targeted them methodically. Mines would blow off tracks, immobilizing the tanks. Then, flamethrower teams would approach from the flanks. They would spray burning fuel through vision slits or engine vents. Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles with burning rags, would explode on engine compartments, setting the tanks ablaze. Crews that escaped the burning vehicles were cut down by machine gun fire. The early armour operations had demonstrated a painful truth. Tanks without infantry support were death traps. By late July, several Stuarts had been knocked out or disabled. The lesson had been learned at a terrible cost. By July 29th, The 1st Battalion, 169th Regiment, was brought over from Rendova. The entire 169th was assigned a zone between the 172nd and the 103rd. Supported by 4 tanks from the 10th Defence Battalion and engineers with flamethrowers, Hodges' forces pressed the Japanese back until they held only the crest of Shimizu Hill. But the slow progress continued to frustrate senior commanders. Generals Griswold and Millard Harmon had lost confidence in Hester's ability to command. He was exhausted, worn down by 3 weeks of continuous combat under brutal conditions. The division's lackluster performance reflected his exhaustion. On July 29th, Hester was officially relieved of command. Major General John Hodge would take over the 43rd Division. In Beitler's northern sector, patrols discovered on July 28th that Bartley Ridge was only lightly defended. The Japanese were pulling back. On July 29th, the 3rd Battalion infiltrated the abandoned pillboxes at the top of the ridge without opposition. Holland launched another assault on Horseshoe Hill with artillery support. His troops reoccupied Wing Hill and pushed toward the crest again. But once again, heavy machine gun fire forced them back. The 1st Battalion dug in within 15 yards of the top. 15 yards that might as well have been 15 miles. By this point, General Sasaki knew his position was becoming untenable. American pressure was unrelenting. His forces had suffered tremendous losses over 3 weeks of defensive fighting. Ammunition was running low. Food supplies were dwindling. The wounded couldn't be properly evacuated. And the combined American bombardment had turned much of Munda into a cratered wasteland. Sasaki had received new orders to keep supply lines to Kolombangara secure. This meant withdrawing to a new defensive line running from Kokengolo Hill to Hachiman Hill. But for the withdrawal to succeed, Shimizu Hill and Horseshoe Hill had to be held as long as possible to cover the retrograde movement. On July 31st, as darkness fell over the battlefield, the Japanese began their carefully planned withdrawal. Units at the Ilangana line pulled back under cover of fire from Horseshoe Hill. Much equipment was left behind, too heavy to carry, too valuable to destroy. Wounded who couldn't walk were given grenades to end their own lives rather than be captured. By dawn on August 1st, the Japanese had safely withdrawn and reassembled at Kokengolo and Bibilo Hills. Colonel Tomonari's surviving forces also began withdrawing that night. The remnants of the elite 13th Regiment, decimated by the failed counteroffensive and Colonel Tomonari's death, slipped through the American lines in darkness and rain. By dawn, they were gone, fading into the jungle like ghosts. August 1st, 1943. Meeting no resistance, American forces advanced across abandoned Japanese positions. It was an eerie experience. Pillboxes that had held out for weeks were empty. Trenches that had cost dozens of American lives to approach were deserted. The defenders had vanished in the night. Colonel Stuart Baxter's 148th Regiment rejoined the 37th Division. General Hodges' troops walked across Shimizu Hill and Lambete Plantation without firing a shot. General Beitler finally captured Horseshoe Hill, finding it abandoned after 3 weeks of trying to take it by assault. As darkness fell, Griswold ordered a general and aggressive advance for August 2nd. He had also brought over the 27th Regiment on July 31st to reinforce Beitler's right flank. The experienced unit wasn't expected to be in position until August 3rd, but its presence gave Griswold more flexibility. August 1st also saw the beginning of an intensive artillery bombardment by General Barker's forces on Rendova. Shells crashed down continuously on Cokengolo Hill and Bibilo Hill. The bombardment was so intense that Japanese units had to take refuge deep in their tunnels. This prevented them from establishing Sasaki's new defensive line properly. Every time troops tried to dig new positions, artillery fire drove them underground. On August 2nd, Griswold's aggressive advance began across the entire front. The momentum had shifted decisively. Japanese resistance was crumbling. By late afternoon, the 103rd had reached the outer taxiways of Munda Airfield. Troops could see the coral runway, cratered by bombs, but still visible. The 169th had pulled up just short of Bibilo Hill. The 37th Division plunged forward past Horseshoe Hill, gaining almost 700 yards in a single day. The ferocity of the American advance caught the Japanese by surprise. Colonel Yano's position was swept so quickly that the American forces overran an entire battalion without realizing it. In the confusion of the rapid advance, Yano managed to withdraw his troops northward without being cut off. All airstrikes in the area had to be cancelled because of the close proximity of troops. The fighting was too confused, the lines too fluid. Aircraft couldn't distinguish friend from enemy in the jungle canopy below. The risk of friendly fire was too great. On August 3rd, Griswold's general advance continued with unrelenting pressure. In the more open terrain around the airstrip, American troops could finally use their mortars with full effectiveness. Without thick jungle canopy to deflect the shells, mortar fire was devastating. The advance speeded up significantly. Against Cokengolo and Bibilo Hills, American regiments still faced determined opposition. But by nightfall, the situation had become hopeless for the defenders. Sasaki ordered them to continue the withdrawal toward the Kure 6th Farm at Zieta. The defense of Munda was effectively over. The following morning, after a severe bombing and strafing attack by Air Solomon's aircraft, Griswold commenced his last push. In Hodges' sector, Marine tanks from the 10th Defence Battalion, this time properly coordinated with infantry, supported the assault on Cokengolo Hill. The difference was dramatic. With infantry protecting them from anti-tank teams, the tanks could move forward and reduce pillboxes with direct fire. In Beitler's sector, the 27th Regiment took over the northern flank. This freed the 148th to push alongside the 161st toward the western beach. The two regiments advanced rapidly through lighter opposition. The Cokengolo Hill defenders fought stubbornly, but were gradually forced back. They retreated toward Congo Hill. Before the 161st could cut them off by reaching the sea, they managed to reach their fallback position. But elements of the 27th were waiting. The retreating Japanese ran directly into American ambushes. The heaviest fighting occurred in the Bibilo Hill area. The 145th Regiment was up against the bulk of the dug-in 229th Regiment, tough, experienced troops who had been on New Georgia since February. These men had built the defences. They knew every trail, every position, every field of fire. But by the end of August 4th, even they had been forced to withdraw, leaving only a small rearguard to delay American pursuit. On August 5th, 1943, Bibilo Hill was finally secured. The Japanese abandoned Congo Hill to continue their retreat northward toward Bairoko. General Griswold's forces occupied Munda, facing only scattered resistance from rear guards. At long last, Munda had fallen. The airfield was in American hands. The cost had been terrible. From July 2nd through August 5th, American forces suffered approximately 4,994 casualties killed and wounded. Against this, the Japanese lost 4,683 confirmed killed, with an unknown number of wounded evacuated by barge during the fighting. One Coral airstrip. 5 weeks of hell. Yard by bloody yard through endless mud. The terrain had been as deadly as the enemy. Malaria struck down hundreds. Dysentery weakened men until they could barely walk. Heat stroke claimed dozens. Exhaustion broke even the strongest soldiers. And the unprecedented number of neuropsychiatric casualties, approximately 1,950 men evacuated for combat stress, spoke to the psychological horror of jungle warfare. But Munda mattered strategically. It was one of 4 new air bases secured during the Central Solomons campaign. From these bases, American aircraft could dominate the skies over the northern Solomons. They could support future operations against Bougainville and Rabaul. They could intercept Japanese reinforcement convoys before they reached their destinations. They could provide air cover for Allied shipping moving up the slot. The strategic value was undeniable, but so was the human cost. And the lesson was brutally clear. Every island would be this hard. Every airfield would demand its price in blood. The question wasn't whether to continue. The question was whether America had the national will to pay that price repeatedly, island after island, all the way to Tokyo. For now, the answer was yes. While Munda was falling, another battle was brewing at sea. A battle that would finally demonstrate American mastery of night combat. After the debacle at Kolombangara, American naval commanders had absorbed painful lessons. Cruisers couldn't effectively fight Japanese destroyers in restricted waters at night. The long lance torpedo gave the Japanese too much advantage. American cruisers were too vulnerable, too slow to maneuver, too dependent on guns instead of torpedoes. But destroyers could fight destroyers, and Commander Frederick Moosbrugger had developed a new battle plan. Actually, the plan had been formulated by Commander Arleigh Burke, the same officer whose destroyers had bombarded Munda. Burke understood that American doctrine had been backwards. Use torpedoes as the primary offensive weapon, not guns. Attack first with torpedoes at long range. Then close and finish with gunfire. It was a fundamental shift in American naval tactics, and it was about to pay spectacular dividends. On August 6th, Admiral Samejima decided to send another reinforcement convoy to Kolombangara. Captain Sugiura Kaju would command 3 destroyers, carrying a battalion of replacements. Captain Hara Tamechi's destroyer Shigure would serve as rear guard. Total force, 4 destroyers with roughly 1,200 troops embarked. Admiral Wilkinson received intelligence reports of the enemy convoy from coast watchers. He ordered Commander Moosbrugger to depart Tulagi by midday with 6 destroyers. Sweep Vela Gulf until the early hours of August 7th. Intercept and destroy the Japanese force. Moosbrugger's battle plan was elegant in its simplicity. Divide his force into 2 formations, a torpedo group and a gun group. The torpedo group would attack first after gaining radar contact with the enemy. They would fire their full spreads and then withdraw. The gun group would maneuver to cut across the enemy's bows. When the torpedoes hit, the gun group would open fire and finish off crippled ships. Captain Sugiura knew he had been detected. Coastwatcher reports had been transmitted in the clear. He was prepared to fight as he entered Vela Gulf during the night. But being prepared wouldn't be enough. Moosbrugger's destroyers passed through Gizo Strait shortly after midnight. They turned southeast toward Blackett Strait, then north up the Gulf with the torpedo group leading. The night was moonless and dark. The bulk of Kolombangara loomed behind the American vessels, providing a dark backdrop that made them nearly invisible. At 23:33, radar on Moosbrugger's flagship Dunlap detected the Japanese at 19,700 yards, over 10 miles. Immediately, Moosbrugger changed course to close the range. He began calculating torpedo firing solutions. Radar operators refined the contacts. 4 separate targets. The expert Japanese lookouts, legendary for their night vision, failed to spot the Americans. Several factors worked against them. The lack of moonlight meant there was no silhouette to see. Kolombangara's dark mass behind the American ships made them blend into the background. And the Japanese were looking ahead, toward their destination, not behind them. At 23:41, at a range between 4,800 and 5,300 yards, less than 3 miles, Moosbrugger gave the order to fire. 22 Mark 15 torpedoes, launched from 6 destroyers. The weapons entered the water with barely a splash and accelerated to 46 knots. 5 minutes later, Moosbrugger turned his torpedo group east and increased speed. Their job was done. Now they would clear the area and let the torpedoes do their work. Commander Roger Simpson's gun group simultaneously changed course to cross Sugiura's projected track. They would be in perfect position to engage survivors. At the last second, perhaps 30 seconds before impact, Japanese lookouts spotted torpedo wakes in the phosphorescent water. Shouts went up. Rudders were thrown hard over. But at less than 3 miles, there was no time for evasive maneuvers. Beginning at 23:45, at least 7 of the 22 torpedoes found their targets. 3 massive explosions lit up the night. The destroyers, Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze, were struck by multiple torpedoes. Secondary explosions followed as fuel and ammunition detonated. The 3 ships were transformed into burning wrecks, dead in the water, listing heavily. Only Captain Hara's Shigure, lagging slightly behind the formation, managed to avoid the carnage. He fired 8 torpedoes blindly toward the American gun flashes, though none would hit. Then he made a hard turn to starboard and fled north at maximum speed, 34 knots, pushing his engines to the limit. After the torpedo impacts, Simpson's gun group immediately opened fire. Slow, deliberate, methodical gunfire. There was no need to rush. The Japanese ships weren't going anywhere. 5-inch shells crashed into the burning destroyers. Over the next hour, Simpson systematically sank all 3 crippled vessels. Of the roughly 1,200 Japanese troops and crew aboard the 3 destroyers, approximately 1,200 were killed. Most drowned when the ships went down. Others died from wounds, from hypothermia in the water, or from shark attacks in the hours before rescue arrived. Only a few hundred survived to be picked up by Japanese search craft over the following days. The Battle of Vela Gulf was over in less than 30 minutes. For the first time in the New Georgia campaign, Japanese destroyers had been decisively beaten in a night action. American doctrine had evolved. American tactics had been refined. and American torpedoes had finally been used effectively as the primary weapon. This victory prevented the arrival of 1,200 Japanese reinforcements who might have significantly prolonged the fighting. It demonstrated that American destroyers, properly employed with sound doctrine, could defeat their Japanese counterparts. The psychological impact was enormous. American sailors gained confidence. Japanese sailors began to doubt their invincibility. The balance at sea was shifting. The tide was turning. With Munda captured on August 5th, Admiral Halsey immediately turned his attention to the next objective. The original plan called for attacking Kolombangara. Intelligence estimated nearly 10,000 Japanese troops defended the island. Another Munda. Another 5 weeks of jungle hell. Another 5,000 casualties. Halsey made a bold decision. Bypass Kolombangara completely. Leap over it to Vella La Vella, 25 miles northwest. Cut the Japanese supply lines. Let Kolombangara wither without reinforcement or resupply. It was classic island-hopping strategy: avoid strength, exploit weakness. A reconnaissance mission on July 22nd had already scouted Vella La Vella. The report was encouraging. Few enemy troops on the island. A feasible airfield site at Baracoma with adequate beach approaches for LSTs. Good terrain for rapid construction. The plan was approved immediately. Brigadier General Robert McClure would command the Northern Landing Force. The 35th Infantry Regiment formed the corps. The 4th Marine Defence Battalion would provide anti-aircraft protection and coastal artillery. The 58th Naval Construction Battalion, Seabees, would build the airfield. Naval Base Group would establish port facilities. Total strength, approximately 6,500 men. For the operation to succeed, 2 conditions had to be met. First, air supremacy over Vella La Vella. Second, artillery emplaced at Pairu Plantation and the Inogai-Bairoko area to interdict Japanese barge traffic to Vila. The Seabees at Munda had worked miracles. Despite Japanese artillery fire and air raids, they had begun repairing the cratered runway immediately after the airfield was secured on August 5th. Working around the clock, they filled bomb craters, leveled rough spots, and extended the strip. By August 14th, just 9 days after capture, they had a functional runway approximately 3,600 feet long and over 100 feet wide. P-40 Warhawk and Corsair fighters were ready to provide air cover for the Vella La Vella invasion. On August 15th, the amphibious assault began. Admiral Wilkinson's Task Force, 31, approached Gizo Strait shortly after midnight. 10 destroyers, 5 destroyer transports, 12 LCIs, 3 LSTs, and 2 subchasers. A substantial force for what intelligence suggested would be an unopposed landing. The convoy proceeded cautiously through the darkness. Unloading began in the early hours of August 15th. The first waves came ashore without resistance. By 0800, 2 battalions of the 35th Regiment had landed and were establishing a defensive perimeter. Then the Japanese arrived. A reconnaissance bomber had spotted the convoy and radioed Rabaul. Admiral Samejima immediately scrambled a strike force. 48 Zeros and 6 dive bombers lifted off and headed southeast. American fighters were waiting. Combat air patrol had been established over Baracoma at first light. When the Japanese formation appeared, 16 Corsairs and 16 Wildcats dove to intercept. the air battle spread across the sky over Vella La Vella. Planes twisted and turned in deadly aerial combat. The American fighters prevented the Japanese bombers from reaching the shipping. Not a single bomb hit an Allied vessel. 13 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The Americans lost 5 fighters. It was a lopsided victory that demonstrated American air superiority. At 09:15, with all combat troops safely ashore, 3 slow LSTs began the laborious process of unloading construction equipment, heavy guns, and supplies. This was the vulnerable phase. LSTs had to beach themselves, lower their ramps, and offload cargo. The process took hours. During that time, they were sitting ducks. The Japanese launched 2 more airstrikes before the LSTs finally retracted at 1800 hours. Both were intercepted and broken up by American fighters. 12 men were killed on the beach when some bombs fell nearby. 40 were wounded, but no ships were damaged. No supplies were lost. The amphibious invasion of Vella La Vella was a resounding success. Without ground combat, American forces had secured another forward base. The bypass strategy, avoiding Japanese strongpoints and seizing lightly defended objectives, was working perfectly. The Japanese reaction revealed their desperation. Initial plans called for wiping out the American beachhead with a single battalion. 1 battalion against 6,500 Americans. General Imamura wisely rejected this suicide mission. 3 to 4 battalions would be the minimum required for any chance of success. But those battalions couldn't be spared. Bougainville needed every available man for its defense. Instead, the Japanese sent a token force, 2 rifle companies, and 1 naval platoon. Their mission: establish a barge staging base at Horanyu on the northeast corner of Vella La Vella. From there, maintain a supply route to Kolombangara through Choiseul. Hold on as long as possible. Delay the inevitable. On August 17th, the reinforcement convoy departed Rabaul. It was spotted by reconnaissance aircraft shortly after leaving port. American bombers attacked, but scored no hits. On the night of August 18th, despite continued harassment, the Japanese successfully landed their troops at Horanyu. The battle for Vella La Vella had begun. But compared to Munda, it would be a sideshow, a mopping-up operation rather than a major battle. The Central Solomons campaign was entering its final phase. The Americans had broken through at Munda after 5 weeks of hell. They had secured Vella La Vella with barely a shot fired. They had learned how to fight the Japanese at night and win. Air superiority was absolute. Naval superiority was growing. The cost had been terrible, but the lessons learned would save countless lives in future campaigns. Tank infantry coordination, the importance of flamethrowers, the value of overwhelming firepower, the need for realistic training before combat, the psychological toll of jungle warfare. Every lesson written in blood, but lessons that would carry American forces forward, island by island, airfield by airfield, all the way to Tokyo. After the fall of Munda on August 5th, General Sasaki's forces continued their retreat northward with American units in hot pursuit. General Griswold divided responsibility for cleanup operations. The 25th Division, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, would drive across New Georgia to secure the northern side of the island. General Hodges' 43rd Division would take the contiguous islands of Banga and Arundel. Collins immediately sent forces up two routes. The 1st Battalion, 27th Regiment, and Colonel Dalton's 161st Regiment would advance up the Bairoko Trail. The rest of Colonel Douglas Sugg's 27th would move along the Zieta Trail toward Piru Plantation. Both routes led through some of the worst terrain in New Georgia. On August 7th, upon learning of the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Vela Gulf, Sasaki realized his situation was deteriorating rapidly. 800 Japanese reinforcements had drowned when 3 destroyers were sunk. No more troops would be coming. He ordered a general withdrawal to Kolombangara by way of Banga Island. The reinforced Yano Battalion would be left behind to defend the Kure 6th Farm and delay the American advance. The 3rd Battalion, 23rd Regiment would secure Banga Island as a staging point for the evacuation. Every hour of delay bought time for more troops to escape across Blackett Strait to Vila. But when Sasaki radioed his plans to 8th Fleet headquarters, he received unexpected orders. Hold a portion of New Georgia until late September for future operations. This forced him to commit the entire 229th Regiment to Banga's defense. What should have been a temporary delaying action became a protracted defense that would cost both sides dearly. On August 8th, Sugg's 2nd Battalion entered a deep ravine roughly 2 miles up the Zieta Trail. Immediately, they came under heavy machine gun fire from concealed positions. Just ahead, the Yano Battalion was defending a supply route through Lulu Channel, where barges could land reinforcements and evacuate wounded. The Japanese needed every hour to complete their withdrawal. The next day, the 27th began its assault on the Kure 6th Farm. They attempted several enveloping maneuvers against the Japanese defences. Each time, the Yano Battalion threw them back. According to unit reports, the defenders employed various harassing tactics, including noise discipline violations, designed to unnerve the Americans and create the impression of larger forces. These attacks gradually confined the Japanese into a smaller defensive area, but they refused to break. At the same time, the 1st Battalion, 27th Regiment, had trekked north on the Munda Bairoko Trail and made contact with Colonel Liversedge's forces. The 161st Regiment was still far behind, struggling through swampy terrain that sucked at boots with every step. Men carrying supplies or weapons found the going nearly impossible. On August 10th, General Hodge ordered the 169th Regiment to reconnoitre Banga Island. The next day, patrols from the 3rd Battalion located a Japanese strongpoint on the southwest tip. The defenders had established well-camouflaged positions with interlocking fields of fire. Taking this small island would not be easy. By nightfall on August 10th, American pressure against the Kure 6th Farm forced Colonel Yano to withdraw across the Zieta River to form a new defensive perimeter. To cover the retreat and deceive the Americans about his movements, Japanese troops engaged in harassment throughout the night. The noise and activity convinced the 27th that a major counterattack was being prepared. The Americans pulled back cautiously. The following morning, American forces bombarded what they believed to be occupied positions before crossing the river. They found abandoned fortifications. The Japanese had slipped away in darkness. The cat-and-mouse game continued as American forces stopped short of Yano's new defences. On August 12th, General Barker assumed temporary command of the 43rd Division. He immediately ordered a company to attempt a landing on Banga. But as the American boats approached the shore, heavy fire erupted from hidden positions. The troops suffered casualties and were forced to withdraw. The Japanese were dug in deep and waiting. On August 13th, Sug's 3rd Battalion launched its main assault against the Yano Battalion. The right flanking attack was stopped almost immediately by heavy fire. On the left, marshy terrain made movement nearly impossible. The battalion swung too far left and lost contact with the enemy entirely. Although the frontal attack failed, the unintended movement to the left proved valuable. A patrol from H Company stumbled upon a heavily used trail leading to Lulu Channel, where Japanese barges were landing supplies. A roadblock was quickly established. That night, the Americans ambushed the first Japanese supply party coming up the trail. The sudden firefight killed several Japanese soldiers and scattered the rest into the jungle. This convinced Yano he was about to be cut off from his supply line. He immediately prepared to withdraw the following night before the Americans could tighten the noose. Meanwhile, Barker had decided to use tiny Vela Sila Island as a staging base for a larger assault on Banga. On the morning of August 14th, the 3rd Battalion, 169th Regiment, moved into Vela Sila and then successfully landed at Banga. But the Americans promptly found themselves in trouble. They had landed in a mangrove swamp with limited room to maneuver. Japanese forces quickly surrounded them and launched counterattacks. The battalion fought desperately through the day and into the night, holding their precarious position. At the same time, Yano's forces had repelled American attacks at Zieta during the day. As dusk approached, he began his westward withdrawal. Despite a brief but intense firefight with H Company at the roadblock, Yano successfully moved his entire battalion to Banga by August 15th. His delaying action had bought precious time for Sasaki's main forces. After capturing the abandoned Zieta village, the 27th set out for Piru Plantation and Sunday Inlet. Almost immediately, they encountered a deep swamp unlike anything they had seen before. The water came up to their chests in places. Hidden sinkholes threatened to swallow men whole. Leeches attached themselves to any exposed skin. Progress slowed to a crawl. General Collins later reflected on this ordeal with grim clarity. In his accounts of the campaign, he described the physical challenge of crossing New Georgia's swamps as among the most difficult experiences of the war. Men struggled forward, yard by yard, exhausted, disease-ridden, but determined to pursue the retreating enemy. By this point, the 27th Regiment had suffered 168 casualties fighting the Yano Battalion, a significant price for advancing through terrain that seemed determined to kill as efficiently as any enemy. On Banga, the Americans continued fighting off fierce counterattacks. Barker decided to commit overwhelming force, landing 3 additional battalions. 4 American battalions would now work to clear one small island. The disparity in numbers should have made the outcome certain, but the Japanese weren't cooperating. From August 16th through 18th, the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Regiment, and elements of the 229th Regiment defended stubbornly. Despite being outnumbered roughly 4-1, they held their positions and inflicted casualties on every American advance. The Yokosuka 7th S NLF's 12cm naval guns even began shelling Munda Airfield from Banga. The harassment fire caused minor casualties and damage, but it demonstrated that the Japanese still had fight left in them. On August 16th, General Barker's artillery on Rendova responded with precise counter-battery fire. The following day, 13 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers executed a devastating carpet bombing mission. The small target area was saturated with explosives. The Yokosuka 7th guns never fired again. The crews had been killed, or the guns themselves destroyed beyond use. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion, 169th Regiment, faced the strongest Japanese defensive pocket. They tried repeatedly to push westward, where the 3rd Battalion, 172nd Regiment, could join the attack. Each attempt was repulsed. The Japanese held every yard of ground, as if it were sacred soil. As the 2nd Battalion made minimal progress, Barker landed the 1st Battalion, 172nd Regiment, on August 18th. 4 American battalions were now committed to clearing Baanga. The overwhelming numerical superiority should have crushed the defenders quickly. Instead, the fierce 3rd Battalion, 23rd Regiment, continued offering stubborn resistance that cost American lives with each attack. On August 19th, however, the 1st Battalion finally achieved a breakthrough. They fought their way to the southwestern coast. There they found the abandoned 12-centimeter guns, spiked and useless, but testament to how close the Japanese had come to disrupting operations at Munda. That night, with their position becoming untenable, the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Regiment executed a daring escape. They slipped through the mangrove swamp and between American positions in darkness and driving rain. Making their way north, they successfully linked up with other withdrawing units crossing into Arundel Island. By nightfall on August 20th, virtually all Japanese forces had escaped. The cost of clearing Baanga had been significant for the Americans. Combat casualties included approximately 52 killed and 110 wounded, with additional non-battle casualties from disease and heat exhaustion bringing total losses higher. For an island that would serve little strategic purpose once Munda was secured, the price seemed steep. Because of the division's performance during this period, General Wing replaced Barker as commander of the 43rd Division on August 20th. In the meantime, the 25th Division continued its northward advance through New Georgia's interior. The conditions were nightmarish. Constant rain turned trails into rivers of mud. Men slipped and fell repeatedly, covering themselves in muck. Equipment was lost in swamps. Disease spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. Supplies had to be carried by hand because no vehicles could navigate the terrain. Occasionally, supplies were airdropped, but many bundles disappeared into the jungle canopy or landed in inaccessible swamps. By mid-August, the 161st Regiment finally reached Mount Bow. General Collins planned for them to turn west and secure an artillery position at Mount Tirokiambo. From there, American guns could support an assault on Bairoko. Colonel Dalton would attack from the west with the 3rd Battalion, 145th Regiment. The 1st Battalion, 27th Regiment, would attack from the east alongside Colonel Liversedge's remaining forces. But once again, the terrain defeated American plans. An impassable swamp blocked the route to Mount Tirokiambo. Engineers studied the problem but could find no solution. Only through extraordinary effort were some 155mm guns manhandled to Zieta Hill by August 21st. The artillery would have to support the attack from there. Meanwhile, Admiral Ota's barge operations had been running smoothly. Every night, under cover of darkness and protected by guns on Kolombangara, barges slipped into Bairoko to evacuate troops. The operation was methodical and efficient. By the time American forces were ready to attack, most Japanese troops had already been withdrawn. After an unsuccessful American raid against the barge staging areas, the evacuation of Bairoko was completed on the night of August 22nd. The timing was perfect, just as Collins's forces were approaching for what they expected to be a major battle. On August 23rd, Dalton and Liversedge entered Bairoko unopposed. They found a ghost town. Supplies had been removed or destroyed. Equipment lay scattered where it had been abandoned. Foxholes and bunkers stood empty. The Japanese had vanished like smoke in the night, leaving only the traces of their occupation. The same day, the 27th Regiment arrived at Piru Plantation after yet another exhausting march. The men were hollow-eyed and gaunt. Many showed signs of malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. The physical toll of pursuing an enemy through New Georgia's interior had been enormous. On August 23rd, Admiral Samejima issued new orders to Sasaki. Hold the Gizo-Kolombangara-Arundel defensive line. Prepare for eventual evacuation, but buy as much time as possible. Accordingly, on August 26th, Sasaki sent 2 reinforced companies of the 1st Battalion, 13th Regiment to Arundel to defend the northern coast. 2 days later, he dispatched 2 companies of the 45th Regiment to hold Gizo Island. Admiral Ota's barges continued their nightly runs to Arundel throughout late August. They brought retreating units back to Vila and ferried reinforcements to maintain the defensive line. By month's end, most evacuated units had reached Vila. The Kure 6th SNLF took responsibility for defending Kolombangara's western coast. The 229th Regiment deployed to Mbambare Harbour to protect the eastern approaches. Meanwhile, in the Diamond Narrows between New Georgia and Kolombangara, the Americans were constructing a new airfield at Ondonga. To protect this development, General Wing was tasked with clearing Arundel Island. On August 29th, the 172nd Regiment was transported to Arundel to begin operations. The regiment's 2 battalions began moving along the shoreline. Progress was agonizingly slow. The shoreline consisted of hard coral that cut through boot leather. Mangrove tangles formed nearly impenetrable barriers. Moving inland was impossible due to dense undergrowth. Men hacked at vegetation with machetes until their hands blistered and arms ached. At this rate, clearing the entire island would take weeks. On September 5th, the 2nd Battalion, 172nd Regiment, finally discovered the main Japanese defensive positions. At the same time, the 1st Battalion landed at Bustling Point to secure a forward artillery position. From there, they moved to occupy the tip of the Bombo Peninsula. The 172nd made no immediate attack. They were still getting into position and assessing Japanese strength. The Japanese commanders were pleased with their success in holding Arundel. Combined with their frustration over American artillery at Piru Plantation, which could now shell Kolombangara, this led General Sasaki to order a counter-offensive. If successful, they could drive the Americans off Arundel and silence those troublesome guns. Shortly after midnight on September 9th, the 3rd Battalion, 13th Regiment, crossed Blackett Strait in barges. They landed on Sagekarasa Island with orders to drive American forces from northern Arundel. The elite 13th Regiment was being committed to what Sasaki hoped would be a decisive counterattack. But fate intervened. A few hours later, General Griswold coincidentally ordered Colonel Sugg's 27th Regiment to advance on Bombo Village from the west. On September 12th, Sugg began his eastward advance. The following day, his 3rd Battalion landed directly in the middle of Sagekarasa Island. The 2 Japanese battalions were suddenly cut off. Surprised but undaunted, the Japanese launched immediate counterattacks from both directions. Screaming charges erupted from east and west simultaneously. The fighting was close quarters and brutal, but the Americans held the blocking position despite tremendous pressure. Further south, Sug's 2nd Battalion encountered the main Japanese defensive line. Heavy machine gun fire from well-prepared positions stopped their advance cold. Additionally, the 1st Battalion, 169th Regiment, occupied the small fringe islands. A battalion of 4.2-inch mortars was also landed at Bombo. These mortars would turn Sagakarasa Island into a killing ground. From the last fringe island, American forward observers had perfect visibility. They could track Japanese barges in the moonlight from the moment they left Vila until they approached Sagakarasa. This allowed American mortars to pre-register targets and fire with devastating accuracy. The mortar bombardment was methodical and deadly. Shells fell among landing craft before they could beach. Japanese troops wading ashore were cut down by shrapnel. The beaches became charnel houses. Casualties mounted rapidly, including the 3rd Battalion commander, who was killed during the bombardment. The close-quarters fighting at Sagakarasa continued through mid-September. Japanese troops briefly penetrated American positions and destroyed communications equipment. But General Barker's artillery from Rendova laid precise box barrages around threatened positions. The concentrated fire forced surviving Japanese to retreat. In response to the deteriorating situation, Griswold brought forward another battalion and 5 Marine tanks on September 16th. The following day, the tanks advanced behind heavy artillery and mortar preparation. The Japanese were caught off guard and forced to fall back. But by September 18th, the Japanese had prepared anti-tank defences. They knocked out 2 tanks with well-placed shots from concealed positions. This allowed the defenders to conduct an orderly withdrawal to Steamer Peninsula. 2 days later, the final evacuation of Arundel began under cover of darkness. During the night of September 19th, the 3rd Battalion evacuated under heavy mortar and artillery fire. The Yokosuka 7th guns on Kolombangara provided covering fire to suppress American positions. The following night, barges successfully evacuated the 1st Battalion troops. The Battle of Arundel came to an end. For the 13th Regiment, Arundel had been extremely costly. Casualty reports indicate approximately 243 Japanese killed and 363 wounded, with particularly heavy losses among officers. American losses were significantly lighter, approximately 31 killed and 225 wounded. Another island secured. Another delaying action concluded. But the Japanese had bought more time for their main evacuation plans. While the brutal island hopping continued around Arundel and Banga, events on Vella La Vella were developing differently. On September 3rd, General Griswold assumed overall command from Admiral Wilkinson. Although initial landings had been unopposed, Halsey's broader plan called for securing the entire island. Major General Harold Barrowclough's 3rd New Zealand Division was scheduled to arrive in mid-September to complete this mission. In the interim, Major Delbert Munson's 1st Battalion, 35th Regiment, received orders to advance up the east coast. They made good initial progress, reaching Lambu Lambu Cove on September 4th. Munson sent A and C companies forward, with a detachment of Fijian commandos acting as scouts. Upon reaching Boko Mission, however, a company unexpectedly encountered a strong Japanese patrol. A fierce firefight erupted in the jungle. When the smoke cleared, 12 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Examination of the bodies and their equipment revealed they were recently landed troops, not stragglers or survivors from earlier fighting. The Japanese had reinforced Vella la Vella. The following morning, a company repelled a strong enemy assault. General McClure recognized this was more than a minor skirmish. He ordered his 3rd Battalion forward, along with artillery batteries, to support Munson's advance. At the same time, Munson cleared the Boko Mission area, which allowed supplies to arrive by boat. He then directed his troops toward the main Japanese defenses at Baka Baka. Facing a steep ridge studded with machine gun positions, Munson found himself in a miniature version of Munda. The Japanese held commanding terrain. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Direct assault would be suicidal. For several days, Munson probed the defences, looking for weaknesses, while his men took casualties from Japanese fire. On September 10th, McClure's artillery batteries finally arrived at Lambu Lambu. They immediately registered targets and opened fire. The American gunners demonstrated remarkable accuracy, dropping shells precisely on Japanese positions. As concentrations began falling with deadly precision, the Japanese realized their positions were compromised. They began withdrawing northwest in growing disarray. On September 14th, Munson's forces attacked Horanyu, expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found only abandoned positions. Dugouts stood empty. Equipment lay scattered. The Japanese had evacuated during the night. Fijian commandos were immediately sent in pursuit, but the enemy had melted into the jungle. Now, the New Zealanders would take centre stage. On September 18th, Admiral Wilkinson transported the first units of General Barrowclough's 3rd Division to a plantation at Joraveto. The initial unloading proceeded smoothly, without Japanese interference. But Admiral Sakamaki at Rabaul had not been idle. He launched a strike force of 48 Zeros and 12 D-3 Aval dive bombers. The formation swung south of the Russell Islands to approach from an unexpected direction. They were intercepted by 27 Allied fighters over Baga Island, just as Wilkinson's escort destroyers were withdrawing from the area. The air battle spread eastward over the landing area. Fighters twisted and turned thousands of feet above the beaches. Bombs fell harmlessly into the water. No Allied shipping was damaged, despite the chaos overhead. The engagement cost the Allies 3 4U Corsairs, while they claimed 15 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Once ashore, Barrowclough assumed command of the Northern Landing Force. He began establishing forward bases up Vella la Vella's east coast. This strategic decision forced Wilkinson to spread his fighter cover more thinly. It also meant LSTs had to operate away from Baracoma's concentrated anti-aircraft defences. The ships would be more vulnerable. On September 25th, a large convoy arrived at Ruravai to establish an advanced marine base for the upcoming Bougainville operation. Admiral Sakamaki saw his opportunity. He launched 8 D-3A dive bombers escorted by 40 Zeros. Brigadier General James Moore had 20 fighters providing combat air patrol, but the Japanese dive bombers managed to slip through the defensive screen. The attack was devastatingly accurate. 2 bombs struck LST-167, forcing the crew to beach the burning vessel. Other bombs hit the beach itself, where Marines were unloading supplies. 32 men were killed instantly. 58 were wounded, many seriously. It was a grim reminder that Japanese air power, though diminished, remained dangerous. On October 1st, Sakamaki struck again over Rurivai. As the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion was landing, his bombers evaded both radar detection and fighter patrols. The attack caught Wilkinson's LSTs completely exposed. One bomb hit, and a near miss struck LST-334, causing significant damage, though miraculously no casualties. But LST-448 suffered 2 direct hits that transformed the ship into an inferno. 52 men died in the flames and explosions. Many more were wounded. Another bomb struck while the ship was under tow, sending LST-448 to the bottom. This would be the final Japanese air attack on Vella Lavella shipping. To the northwest, Fijian commandos operating along the coast had located the scattered Horoniu Defence Force between Tambala Bay and Marquana Bay. Barrowclough directed Brigadier Leslie Potter's 14th Brigade to eliminate this remaining Japanese presence. Potter devised a pincer movement. His 35th Battalion with brigade headquarters would advance up the west coast to Matu Soroto Bay. Meanwhile, the 37th Battalion would circle around the northern coast to land at Duvali Cove. The Japanese would be trapped between converging forces. But on September 21st, Captain Tsuruya Yoshio had arrived from Buin specifically to take command of the disorganized Vella Lavella garrison. He rapidly concentrated his scattered forces at Marquana Bay. There, he established a defensive perimeter and prepared his troops to make a final stand. The Japanese would not surrender without a fight. Potter's 2 battalions successfully landed at their designated locations on September 24th. They prepared to crush the trapped Japanese forces the following day. But the combination of difficult terrain and determined Japanese resistance would complicate matters significantly. By September 26th, Potter's 35th Battalion was closing on Marquana Bay. He sent 2 platoons forward to scout the bay's head. Captain Tsuruya, despite having only meagre forces, had used the time well. His troops surrounded the New Zealand scout platoons and cut them off. The isolated New Zealanders were fighting for survival. Concerned for his trapped men, Potter ordered the 35th Battalion to advance on September 28th. But Captain Tsuruya's defenders stopped them with concentrated machine gun fire from positions hidden in the dense rainforest south of the bay. The New Zealanders took casualties, but couldn't break through. Only on October 2nd were the 2 surrounded platoons finally rescued. By then, 18 New Zealand soldiers were dead and 10 wounded. Potter halted further attacks and ordered the 37th Battalion to march down from Tambala Bay. He would attack from both directions simultaneously. But moving the 37th down the rugged coastline was slow work. The Japanese would have time to prepare, and Admiral Samejima was already planning their evacuation. The grinding retreat was entering its final phase. One more audacious operation remained, and it would be the Japanese Navy's most masterful evacuation yet. By early September 1943, Admirals Samejima and Kusaka recognized that holding Kolombangara was impossible. American forces controlled Munda, Vella Lavella, and the surrounding waters. Japanese supply lines were under constant attack. The garrison on Kolombangara, estimated at nearly 10,000 men, was slowly starving. They had to be evacuated. But evacuating 10,000 troops from an island under constant surveillance seemed impossible. American aircraft flew reconnaissance missions daily. PT boats prowled the waters at night. Any large-scale movement would be detected immediately. Yet the Japanese had done it before. At Guadalcanal in February, they had evacuated over 10,000 troops. At Kiska in the Aleutians in July, they had removed 5,200 men without the Americans knowing until it was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy had become experts at amphibious withdrawals. They would try again. To aid the evacuation, General Imamura contributed Major General Yoshimura Masayoshi's 2nd Shipping Detachment. Yoshimura commanded at least 30 large barges capable of carrying troops and supplies. These vessels could navigate shallow coastal waters where destroyers couldn't go. They were slow and vulnerable but essential. Admiral Ijuin Matsuji proposed using 8th Fleet destroyers for both transport and cover. The destroyers would make high-speed runs to Kolombangara, embark as many troops as possible, and race back to safety. Barges would shuttle troops from Kolombangara to Choiseul, where destroyers would pick them up. Admiral Kusaka approved the plan. He obtained 6 additional destroyers from the combined fleet. The route would go through Choiseul rather than directly up the slot. This added distance but avoided the heaviest American patrols. Limited air cover would be provided over Choiseul by Admiral Sakamaki's depleted air groups. By September 15th, planning was complete. Kusaka himself flew into Vila to discuss final details with General Sasaki and Admiral Ota. His aircraft landed during an American artillery bombardment. Shells exploded nearby as Kusaka walked calmly to the command bunker. It was a dramatic demonstration of his commitment to the operation. The meeting lasted several hours. 3 boarding points were established along Kolombangara's northern coast. Troops would assemble there and board barges or destroyers as quickly as possible. Speed was essential. The longer they remained exposed, the greater the risk. Preparations began on September 20th. To conceal their intentions, the Japanese increased patrolling activity. The Yokosuka 7th guns continued firing to maintain the illusion of ongoing defense. Demolition teams quietly prepared to destroy airfield installations and ammunition dumps. Construction units began cutting trails to the boarding points. The operation was codenamed SE, sometimes rendered SE Go in various transliterations. Stage 1 would evacuate the bulk of the garrison between September 28th and 30th. Stage 2 would remove remaining troops around October 2nd. If successful, most of the garrison would escape. Admiral Halsey suspected something was coming. By late September, intelligence indicated unusual Japanese activity. Either they were reinforcing Kolombangara or preparing to evacuate. Halsey positioned forces to intercept either scenario. On September 25th, he sent Admiral Merrill's cruisers to Port Purvis with orders to move up the slot if needed. Admiral Wilkinson's destroyers would swing south and up Vela Gulf. The plan was to catch the Japanese between converging forces. But torpedo scares and submarine contacts spooked Merrill's cruisers. Halsey pulled them back. Only Wilkinson's destroyers would remain in position. On September 27th, General Yoshimura's barges departed for Kolombangara in separate groups. Moving slowly through darkness, they threaded between American patrol zones. Some groups were spotted, but most slipped through unnoticed. The night of September 28th, Admiral Ijuin departed Rabaul with 11 destroyers. Shortly after midday, a PBY spotted them northeast of Green Island. Generals Moore and Twining immediately scrambled a strike. Just before dark, 5 B-24 Liberator bombers attacked Ijuin's formation. Bombs fell around the destroyers, sending up towering water columns. But none scored hits. The ships took evasive action, their wakes drawing white lines across the darkening sea. 0 fighters from Bougainville harassed the bombers and drove them off. As Ijuin approached Kolombangara that night, Yoshimura's barges were already hiding in concealed coves. Troops had been moved to boarding points. Everything was ready. At midnight, on September 29th, boarding began at Tuki Point. The destroyers came in close to shore, crews ready to depart instantly. Troops climbed aboard quickly and quietly. No lights. No unnecessary noise. Within hours, 1,950 men were packed onto the destroyers. As dawn approached, Ijuin's destroyers departed at high speed toward Buka. On September 29th, 27 B-24 bombers attacked during withdrawal. But bad weather and aggressive Zero escort prevented effective bombing. The destroyers reached Buka safely. The Americans reacted swiftly. Bombers pounded Choiseul throughout the day. Destroyers were deployed across the slot for barge interdiction. Several Japanese barges were sunk or damaged. But the majority got through. Over September 29th and 30th, Yoshimura's surviving barges completed Stage 1. They shuttled troops from Kolombangara to Choiseul. Despite losing considerable barges, the mission was accomplished. Over 6,000 men had been rescued in the first stage. The Japanese achieved surprise through bold execution. American commanders were still determining whether this was reinforcement or evacuation. By the time they confirmed evacuation, the first stage was complete. For Stage 2, Samejima reinforced Yoshimura with additional barges. Ijuin also planned to send 3 destroyers as a decoy toward Vella La Vella to draw American attention. On the night of October 1st, the decoy destroyers were spotted off northwest Choiseul heading toward Vella La Vella. Merrill's cruisers were nearby, but, following orders not to risk heavy units unnecessarily, turned back. Wilkinson's destroyers moved forward to intercept. As the Americans took the bait and advanced toward Vella La Vella, Yoshimura's barges departed Choiseul for Kolombangara. They moved largely unmolested through waters the Americans should have been patrolling. Only 2 barges were reported lost. The deception had worked perfectly. On the morning of October 2nd, Ijuin departed Rabaul with 9 destroyers. At Vila, the Yokosuka 7th guns fired their last rounds. Then, crews spiked their weapons and moved toward the coast. Demolition teams stood ready. As soon as the last troops were aboard, they would destroy everything of value. By nightfall, Ijuin was approaching Kolombangara, while Yoshimura's barges began moving from the island to Choiseul. This time, American forces were more alert. 2 destroyer groups prowled the waters, looking for Japanese shipping. Around midnight, American destroyers encountered some of Yoshimura's barges. Brief but violent engagements erupted in darkness. The destroyer Minazuki was briefly engaged. 5 Japanese barges were sunk. But the main barge force avoided contact and continued toward Choiseul. Meanwhile, Ijuin's destroyers reached Kolombangara and began embarking troops at designated boarding points. Approximately 4,000 men climbed aboard during the night. The operation proceeded smoothly, despite American air and naval activity. By dawn, Ijuin was racing back toward Rabaul, with his destroyers packed with evacuees. Stage 2 was complete. The Americans had sunk some barges, but hadn't stopped the operation. Including both stages, historians estimate roughly 9,000 to 10,000 Japanese troops were evacuated from Kolombangara, though exact totals vary between sources depending on how the operation is defined. It was the third successful major evacuation the Japanese had executed. Each operation demonstrated increasing sophistication and daring. The Imperial Japanese Navy had mastered the art of amphibious withdrawal. But one final drama remained. October 6th, 1943. Captain Tsuruya's unit was trapped at Marquana Bay on Vella La Vella. 589 men, the last organized Japanese force in the Central Solomons. They were cornered, running low on supplies, with New Zealand forces closing in. Admiral Samejima was determined not to abandon them. After the successful Kolombangara evacuation, he convinced a reluctant Kusaka to attempt one more rescue. It would be audacious to the point of recklessness. But the Japanese Navy didn't abandon its men. Admiral Ijuin would command the operation. He departed Rabaul before dawn on October 6th with 9 destroyers. Commander Nakayama Shigeroku would handle the actual evacuation with 5 sub-chasers, 3 vedettes, 7 barges, and 30 folding boats. 8 seaplanes would bomb New Zealand positions at Marquana Bay. 12 Zero fighters would provide air cover. The plan was simple. Get in, load the troops, get out before American forces could react. That same morning, Admiral Wilkinson received intelligence that the Tokyo Express would run that night. But to where? Initial reports suggested Choiseul. Then new intelligence indicated Marquana Bay. Wilkinson made his decision. He sent Captain Frank Walker with 3 destroyers to head up the slot. Pay particular attention to Vella La Vella. Later that afternoon, Wilkinson learned 3 additional destroyers would reinforce Walker. But they couldn't make the rendezvous point until 2340. Walker would likely start the battle alone against superior forces. That night, after scouting Vella La Vella and finding it clear, Ijuin ordered his destroyers to proceed to the staging point at 2200 hours. But minutes later, a scout plane reported 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers northeast of Vella La Vella, heading west. Actually, these were Walker's 3 destroyers, misidentified by the scout. But Ijuin didn't know that. He immediately ordered his transport destroyers to retire west toward the Shortlands. His screening force would turn northeast to meet what he believed was a much stronger enemy formation. This decision would cost him dearly. At 22:30, the Americans made radar contact. 5 minutes later, Japanese lookouts sighted Walker's destroyers to the south. Ijuin turned to port and headed southwest to cross Walker's bows. But he misjudged the distance and opened the range instead. Walker increased speed to 30 knots to close. Ijuin began a series of maneuvers that squandered his initial advantage. He made a simultaneous turn to port that staggered his ships in line abreast almost parallel to Walker. This allowed the Americans to concentrate their fire. The range was closing rapidly. The destroyer, Yugumo, leading the Japanese formation, tried to fight back. But 3 American destroyers focused their guns on her. Shell after shell struck home. Within minutes, Yugumo was reduced to a burning wreck. Ijuin tried to correct his mistake by making a starboard turn back into column formation. He continued around until headed west, But at this point, the two destroyers, under Captain Hara Tamechi, the same Hara who had survived Vela Gulf, finally made contact with Walker. They moved ahead and parallel to the Americans, perfectly positioned to launch torpedoes. At the same time, one of Yagumo's torpedoes, fired before she was crippled, was racing through dark water toward the American formation. At 23:06, it struck the destroyer Chevalier. The torpedo detonated the forward magazine. The ship broke in two. The bow and bridge section swung across O'Bannon's path. The two destroyers collided with a tremendous crash. Then a torpedo from Hara's destroyers hit Selfridge. The entire bow was sheared off. Everything forward of the bridge was simply gone. The destroyer wallowed in the water, barely staying afloat. In those few terrible minutes, 104 American sailors died. 66 were wounded. As both sides continued fighting in confusion, Commander Nakayama's evacuation flotilla began approaching Marquana Bay undetected. Wilkinson's 3 reinforcing destroyers were arriving, but they were too far away to intercept. The small craft slipped into the bay unseen. At 0150 on October 7th, loading began. The 589 men of the Tsuruya unit climbed into boats as quickly as possible. No one spoke above a whisper. Equipment was left behind to save weight. Within an hour and 20 minutes, every man was aboard. At 0310, Commander Nakayama departed Marquana Bay with the entire Tsuruya unit. Not a single man was left behind. The rescue had been executed perfectly, while a naval battle raged just miles away. Back at the battle site, American damage control teams worked frantically. Selfridge, despite losing her bow, remained afloat. Chevalier was beyond saving. O'Bannon, though damaged in the collision, could still steam. Out of Yagumo's burning wreck, the Americans would later capture 74 survivors. 179 Japanese sailors died with their ship. On October 8th, Brigadier Potter's New Zealand forces moved into Marquana Bay. They found it empty. The Japanese had vanished during the night. 4 days later, on October 12th, Colonel Sugg's 27th Regiment occupied Ringi Cove. The 1st Battalion, Fiji Regiment, landed on Kolombangara itself. Patrols swept the island. No Japanese were found. The island had been completely evacuated. On October 15th, Admiral Halsey officially declared Operation Toenails terminated. The Central Solomons campaign was over. On October 13th, the Japanese had similarly declared Operation SE complete, as the last evacuated troops were ferried from Choiseul across the Bougainville Strait to Buin. The final accounting varies between historical sources depending on how the campaign is defined and which actions are included. For the New Georgia and Central Solomons phase, from June through October 1943, American losses are commonly estimated at roughly 1,100 to 1,200 killed and approximately 3,800 to 4,000 wounded. New Zealand and Fiji forces suffered over 200 casualties. Japanese losses for the same period are estimated in the low thousands killed, though precise figures remain uncertain as records were incomplete or lost. But the Americans had achieved their strategic objectives. 4 new air bases, Munda, Segi, Barakoma, and Ondonga, now supported Allied air operations. From these bases, American aircraft dominated the skies over the northern Solomons. They could intercept Japanese convoys. They could strike at Rabaul. They could support the upcoming invasion of Bougainville. The campaign had also provided brutal lessons. Green troops needed better training before combat. Tank infantry coordination was essential. Flamethrowers were decisive against fortified positions. The terrain could be as deadly as the enemy. Psychological casualties could cripple a unit as effectively as combat losses. And the Japanese were masters of defensive warfare and amphibious evacuation. The Central Solomons campaign would never achieve the fame of Guadalcanal or Tarawa or Iwo Jima. History would largely forget New Georgia and Vella Lavella. The names Munda, Bairoko, and Arundel would fade from memory. But the men who fought there would never forget. They would remember the mud and the rain, the endless jungle, the invisible enemy, the pillboxes that had to be burned out one by one, the friends who died for yards of worthless ground, the disease and exhaustion and fear. They would remember the price of island hopping, and they knew that price would be paid again and again. At Bougainville, at Tarawa, at Saipan and Guam, and Peleliu, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Every island had its price. Every coral airstrip was bought with blood. The road to Tokyo was long and brutal, but after the Central Solomons campaign, there was no doubt America would walk that road. No matter how high the cost, no matter how long it took, the tide had turned, and it would never turn back. The final accounting of the Central Solomons campaign reveals a sobering truth. American losses totaled approximately 1,100 to 1,200 killed and roughly 3,800 to 4,000 wounded, depending on which sources and actions are included. New Zealand and other Allied units, including Fijian forces, suffered casualties measured in tens rather than thousands. Japanese losses remain uncertain. Various estimates place roughly 1,600 to several thousand killed, though precise figures vary significantly between sources. For this cost, several new forward airfields were secured. Munda was captured in early August and became operational for Allied aircraft by mid-August. Baracoma, on Vella Lavella, followed on September 27th. Strategic victory had been achieved, but at tremendous human cost. The lessons were brutal but clear. Terrain could be as deadly as the enemy. One division was insufficient for New Georgia's challenges. Green troops were shattered by jungle warfare. Pillbox warfare demanded flamethrowers and overwhelming firepower. The Japanese had mastered defensive fighting and amphibious evacuation. But American doctrine evolved. Destroyer tactics were revolutionized at Vella Gulf. The bypass strategy was validated at Vella Lavella. Tank infantry coordination improved. Yet the human cost remained staggering. Every island would be this hard. Bougainville was next. Then the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas. 2 more years to Tokyo. History would largely forget the Central Solomons campaign, overshadowed by Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. But here the pattern was established. Island hopping's brutal reality. The price of every coral airstrip. American industrial might against Japanese fanatical will. Both sides learning. Both sides adapting. Both sides dying. The long road to victory began here, in the forgotten jungles of New Georgia, where men learned that the Pacific War would be won not through brilliant strategy alone, but through blood, mud, and unimaginable sacrifice. Yard by bloody yard, island by island, all the way to Tokyo,